So punks, Warhammer the Old World 1.5 has crashed to Earth like a great meteor. It's upended the cushy TOW meta and unleashed a new gaming ice age. The apex predators of 1.0, gone, their bones littering the tundra, scavengers picking at their corpses, and in the bubbling primordial soup, strange new beasts are crawling out, wobbling on their hind legs, blinking into the light, and wondering what the hell just happened. And in the middle of this evolutionary riot, I, Dr. Blaxill, Tribune of the People, Scourge of the Spreadsheet Meta, Hand-jobbing Autocrat, Yes-Man Apparatchiks, and Hero of the Proletariat, once more wade fearlessly into the chaos of tournament play. Herein is my 5-round battle report from the Saffron Grand Slam tournament, where I marched my warriors of chaos into war. Yes, you heard me, punks. No Bretonians. The Pegasus Carnage Train, that famous flying chainsaw that left a wake of smouldering ruin in every gaming table it touched and ruined the hobby careers of many a happy middle-aged modeler, has been left sportingly in the hangar. Instead, I unleash the wolves of the sea, hungry for plunder and validation in this brave new ecosystem. And of course, this raises broader questions, does it not? About 1.5. Has it saved the game? Have infantry been resurrected from the dead? Have dragons been declawed? Who's up? Who's down? And who's currently lying sideways in the ditch? And more importantly to that, will Dr. Blaxill once again conquer all, or will it be proved that he's just a one-trick, wind-flapping, counter-charging flying pony? Watch, punks, and find out! Now, for those who are also keeping tabs on the Great Rebellion, despite the sycophantic bleating of the henchmen commentariat with their snouts buried deeply in the dictator's slop trough, I can report to you, if you were wondering, that morale remains high. As a matter of fact, I have just finished inspecting the 1st Battalion of the new rebel militia, a magnificent army of the men of now, fired up with revolutionary spirit and righteous fury at the amalgamated failures and misdeeds of our hated Master Games Workshop. And let me tell you that while these men might be a bit out of shape at the moment, and a bit flabby round the middle, that no finer body of men has ever existed. In another video, which I link to in the description of this one, I discuss this and other contentious matters with my comrade-in-arms and wingman D6 Wounds. So, that's your weekend sorted now, isn't it, punks? Battle reports here, and discussion there. What more do you want? What do you mean your wife won't let you? You want to stay at home and be a family man forever? I'll let you into a secret, punks. Come closer. Very close. There's only you and me in here after all, so it's fine. Now, are you listening? I know about your disgusting habits. I know about the Marlboros. I know about those jeans that you had when you were a student that you've not washed since then because you know you won't fit into them anymore. I gave you that dove at that warehouse rave, and my mate Brian did that tattoo in an unknown language that only recently you discovered meant wanker. And yes, I know about your video nasty collection, and indeed I've been inside your temporary internet files folder on that FAT32 hard drive with all the partially downloaded porn that you got on dial-up. So don't give me that bullshit, punks! We both know the real score, and we both know why you're here. Men like you don't grow up! That's why here and forever you'll stay on the Dr. Blaxill channel! Right, so here's my list for this first encounter with Warhammer the Old World version 1.5. 1.5 has of course brought some quite substantial changes to this game.
to the utility of certain troop types, but also, of course, there are these matched play guide missions. Some events have literally gone bananas with these. They'd been putting baggage trains, strategic locations, domination, king of the hill, and other things all on the table at the same time. Here at the Saffron Slam, though, they've been a bit more restrained, and I'll explain the objectives that are in these games as we come to them. Suffice to say, though, scoring for most of them requires core units with a unit strength of at least 10. Right, so here's my Chaos Army, and it's one of the first times I've actually used this in competitive play in Warhammer the Old World, because I've been favouring Bretonians thus far. This army is actually Wolves of the Sea, which is one of the armies of infamy in the Warriors of Chaos Arcane journal. I don't actually tend to find that this makes an enormous amount of difference, however, because many of the troop types that I would pick would be exactly the same as those in a Grand Army. There are just a few little advantages around the edges, though, to being Wolves of the Sea, which I shall come on to later. So first of all, on to characters, and I'll hand over to them to let them introduce themselves. Good evening, human. My name is Fairfax, and I'm a Chaos Dragon. I'm ridden by a Chaos Lord called Chairman Eddie. He has the mark of Chaos Undivided, a great weapon, a shield, and 2 favours of the gods. While my sovereignty has been diminished on paper to be a mere riding option of a Chaos Lord, make no mistake, I am the real general of this army, and he is merely a mute homunculus who has to ride around on my back and doesn't say anything because I cut his tongue out 10 years ago. Right, so in the first edition of Old World, a Chaos Lord and a Dragon was really a quite compulsory meta pick for a Warriors of Chaos army. Now, of course, things have changed somewhat because there's a 500 point limit on characters. The Chaos Lord, before he buys any equipment, is already 480 points, so he's extremely limited on what he can pick. In this case, I've literally just gone for the bare bones. A great weapon to boost his strength, a shield to give him extra armor save against shooting, and a couple of those useful favours of the gods so he can re-roll on that prayer table and hopefully get a few buffs before he goes into some serious heavy combats from maybe turn 3 onwards. The 1.5 patch has of course introduced the option of having an exalted champion on a Chaos Dragon, whose points cost is less and gives you more magic item options. With that exalted champion option, I could fit the Crown of Everlasting Conquest onto him to give him regen 5 up, and a Brazen Collar to give him magic res 2, and probably have a few points for some other things too. However, I've opted to just go for the bland Chaos Lord option. I like the fact he's got Leadership 9, which will help him resist those caskets and those screams, and I also like the fact that he's got a close order bonus, because he's got unit strength 10. To be honest, I think he's tough enough as it is. He's got 10 wounds, toughness 6, a 3 up armor save and a 5 up ward. That's already monstrously difficult for the enemy to shift, so despite his limited magic item allowance, I think he's going to do just fine, and I'd be very surprised if he dies in more than one game. I have to admit, I've not been a fan of dragons in Warhammer the Old World so far. Not because they're not good, or because they're too good, but because they're boring. Anyway, let's suspend judgment with version 1.5, but suffice to say, I'd be surprised if Fairfax and his mute rider don't do well.
Hey punks, I'm Miss Mirror, and I'm a musician, and I'm here to rinse your eardrums. Actually, just being a 7-point unit upgrade for a unit of Chaos Warriors wasn't good enough for me. So I developed a side business in being a Chaos Sorcerer. I'm pretty shit at it, so I'm only level 1, but I get to go around on this Chaos Chariot with these 2 stupid, groupie, stone, tripped-out, punk poser Chaos Warriors who you can't actually even see. I've got a Ruby Ring of Ruin and a single favour of the gods. I should have told you what my magic lore was. It's demonology.
Hello, boys. My name's Andromeda Dussard, and I'm also, like Miss Mirror, a level 1 Chaos Sorcerer on a chariot. I'm looking to bring a little class to proceedings because this army can be very rude and uncouth, and very noisy. I'm also running the lore of demonology, and am equipped with the Rod of the Damned and a single favour of the gods.
Right, so after the 1.5 patch, magic has been turned upside down in Warhammer the Old World. Instead of adding +4 to their rolls to cast spells, level 4 wizards now only add +2. In my estimation, I think they've overdone this nerf to magic. Unless you're an army that really relies on it, like Tomb Kings and Vampire Counts, I actually think that quite a few armies aren't going to get that much bang from their buck by bringing a level 4 wizard. The competitive logic that is informing my choices of both Miss Mirror and Miss Dissard are the simple fact that Chaos Sorcerers on chariots have toughness 5, 3 up armor save, 5 up ward, and 6 wounds. That's a lot of tanky damage for something that's only a bit over 200 points. I like the fact that the chariot cab gives you 360-degree arcs of vision, hence informing my decision to give them the Ruby Ring of Ruin and the Rod of the Damned respectively, to give me a summoning and a fireball. In terms of their magic lore, I could have gone for battle magic to give them both Hammer Hand, which would of course have fitted their role as combat casters. In the end though, I decided to opt for Demonology, as well as giving them an outside chance of generating Steed of Shadows or Demonic Vigor, 2 of the other very useful Demonology spells. I'm always going to be able to fall back on taking the summoning. That means that if I want, I'm going to have 4 magic missiles in this army. I am going to need to roll quite high to get them, however, but the law of averages suggests I should get 2 per turn. In theory, because they're so tanky, and will in any case have to get within 18 of the opposition to do their summoning spells, I'm hoping that their Dispel auras, while only 18 inches as level 1 wizards, will come into play. I also think that if I adopt the very gamey tactic of stacking these 2 wizards on top of each other by having them touching, something you can do in Warhammer the Old World, that after a few good buffs on that Chaos mutation table, that these 2 ladies should be rather hard to take on together. Right, onto my core units, and I put quite a lot of thought into this. First we have the boys from Benidorm, who are 10 Marauder Tribe Berserkers with flails and throwing axes. I always felt these were rather well costed. Toughness 4, a 6 up ward, movement 5 with warband, and 2 strength 5 attacks on the charge. On hindsight, however, these were rather flawed selection, because I failed to pay attention to the fact that Frenzy has been nerfed, now you only get it when you charge, and also that Flails have been nerfed, again you only get it on your charge. Since infantry, even with movement 5 and warband, ain't going to be charging very often, I rather fear that the Marauder Tribe Berserkers are competitively a bit redundant. Or at least if you don't take ambush, and I didn't. Next we've got Dirty Dick and Razor Mix Football Hooligans. 25 Marauders with the Mark of Chaos Undivided, light armour and shields and full command. I'm very excited to see how this unit performs. Obviously infantry have been buffed massively in version 1.5 of Warhammer the Old World. The second rank can now swing, they've got that outnumbering bonus, and the way that challenges works allows them to see off these massive characters. Because of the way the parry rule now works, they've got a 4-up armor save in combat. They're also as cheap as chips. With 25 of these punks on my side, I think they're going to be well placed to hold objectives. I also think that I might well be facing quite a lot of low-quality tar pit infantry in the shape of skeletons, given the popularity of vampire counts and tomb kings on the circuit recently. Marauders might not be that good at fighting much, but I do think they'll be able to beat them. Next we've got Wasp in My Pint and Leave It Out Gov, which are 2 units of 5 Marauder Horsemen. They've got flails and throwing axes. I think for 70 points, these have got quite a lot of utility. They can skirmish, and they can also go in marching column for a gargantuan 24-inch move. Because they're cav, they are of course unit strength 10, and so will be able to hold objectives, so long as they don't take any casualties. I also think that with 5 strength 5 attacks from flails and some horses, they'll be able to dispose of war machine crews and potentially other sorts of chaff. And then finally in core, because no army would be complete without them, we have Marrowbone Jelly and Meaty Chunks, which are 2 units of 5 Chaos Hounds. These will invariably be deployed in marching column to give them that monstrous 21-inch marching move so they can get in the way. Because infantry are more relevant now in 1.5 of Old World, I think that chaff, i.e. putting cheap units in front of non-flying opponents to block their charges, will be more relevant than it was before. Anyway, the sole purpose of these pesky pooches is to get in the way of my opponent at all costs and piss him off. We don't have any special units in this army, but we do have some rather good ones in rare. Our first selection is Trev and Tone, 2 single Dragon Ogre Shartaks with heavy armour and great weapons. These 2 deformed maniacs are here to press forward and use their 4 strength 7 attacks and 2 strength 5 stomps to flatten the enemy for their mere 73 points. The reason I like these single Dragon Ogre Shartaks in this army is of course because these count as characters. That means that if they go into combat with any of my characters, especially Fairfax and his mute rider Chairman Eddie, they're going to be taking the challenge that's inevitably going to be coming my way. Because of the way overkill bonuses now work, and the fact that you don't get to strike at below your initiative step, dragons have become very vulnerable to one-wound unit champions challenging them out, just like they used to be in previous editions of the game. However, having these single Dragon Ogre Shartaks running around hopefully ought to exempt me from that new problem. And then finally, I've got 2 gigantic spawns of Nurgle, who I've decided to name, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Hi up, Governor. Name's Ashley. I used to sell used cars in Chingford, but now I'm a gigantic spawn of chaos. Don't know how that happened, but if you pay cash, I'm only 170 points. Toughness 6, 6 wounds, 5 up armour and 5 up regen. That's a hell of a load of wallop for them points.
Hello, love. I'm Setsuna. They used to call me the Queen of Camden Passage because I used to pull pints of old boot stout and dead dock ale in the Earl of Derby. But then somehow I also became a gigantic spawn of chaos.
Right, these spawns of chaos are amongst the most overpowered things in the Chaos Army list, and I would argue amongst the most powerful things in the game for their points. They're extremely resilient, and that's not just because of their strength and toughness, but also because they've got a special attack which enables them to recover a wound in combat. They're unbreakable, so excellent for tying things up, and also have random movement 3d6. Now, random movement isn't what it used to be in 8th edition, where you used to spin the model around and then go forwards, but you can nonetheless still, even though you have to do it very awkwardly and by wheeling, this is Old World after all, manage to get some pretty funky charges on your opponent, even when he's out of your vision arc. Just like with the chariots, when there's one of a good thing, it becomes even better when there are 2 of them, and I'm hoping that Ashley and Setsuna can support each other. There is another important point about these gigantic spawn. Because you can choose to flee once your opponent has declared all his charges, rather than it being spontaneous with them as it used to be in previous editions, and of course can reform and move after rallying, the flee move is incredibly powerful in Warhammer the Old World, and that's something that these 2 gigantic spawns stop, because it's not possible to flee from random movement. Right, that's it. I think that's probably about as good as it gets from Wolves of the Sea. I think this army is pretty competitive, and I expect to do fairly well with it. That being said, I also think the meta of 1.5 has drastically shifted in favour of 3 armies, those being Vampire Counts and Tomb Kings for their ability to hold objectives and resurrect zillions of models, and of course a certain new army, approaching from the east, high up in the sky, in hot air balloons. So I catch a late night train on Friday night up to Saffron Walden, a small market town in North Essex. It's a very nice place during the day and if you have a car. But if you travel at night like me, with your motorcycle, it's not so accessible. Or at least not if you're transporting a Warhammer army. There's no direct train from London. The nearest station is several miles away. The last buses go at about 7 o'clock in the evening, and there's no Uber and there's no Bolt. It's all delightfully retro. You have to pre-book taxis by phoning mobile telephone numbers. Indeed, when I was finally ensconced at my Premier Inn after taking an unexpectedly excellent curry at a late-opening Indian restaurant in the town centre, I found it very difficult to arrange a taxi for next morning because most of the local companies strongly disliked the idea of turning up at 8:30 a.m. on Saturday morning for a job. I must admit I always find it something of a safari going to some of these small towns in England to play Warhammer, where many of these tournaments are often held, and observing the social and economic customs that I find there. But then I am, I suppose, a London snob. Right, that's enough introductory flim-flam, and let's get on to Game 1. My suspicions about the new centres of power in Warhammer the Old World are rather confirmed. Nearly half the players at this tournament are taking either Vampire Counts, Tomb Kings or Grand Cathay, so it's perhaps not a surprise that I've encountered one of them in my first game. So my opponent here is Ian, and he's going to be running Tomb Kings. Now, I don't like Tomb Kings. I have nothing against the players that use them, and Ian seems like a smashing bloke. but they're full of two very unpleasant ranged threats in caskets and a shabti with great bows. He's also got two wizards on necromancy. What this army does is stand in its deployment zone, shoot you with the great bows, and then use Spirit Leech and Spiritual Vortex with necromancy, and then destroy you with the Caskets of Souls. When your depleted forces reach their lines and kill some of the skeletons, their 4 different resurrection abilities that you can't interact with or dispel simply grow all the skeletons back. It's not entirely unusual when facing armies like this to score no points whatsoever. I also find that given the vast amounts of admin involved in playing Tomb Kings due to their spells and resurrection abilities, that tournament games against them don't tend to run the full number of turns. That means they often end up getting ahead because of their ability to shoot things off, and you don't get the ability to get those points back when you reach them because you've run out of time. I should make it clear that I'm not accusing Tomb King players of doing this deliberately. It's an unfortunate side consequence of this very fiddly and admin-heavy army, which tends to score a lot of points in the early game. Therefore, if you're playing competitively against Tomb Kings, especially in shorter time-limited rounds, or ones that have got missions and take longer, you're going to have to be pretty aggressive if you're something like Warriors of Chaos. Right, so here's the deployment. There's no special objective in this round, and so it's just going to be a question of killing each other. You can see that in the time-honoured style of Tomb Kings, Ian has bunched his army together in a clump. To the top of the battlefield, where Ian's hand is, you can see a big unit of Tomb Guard. They've got 2 characters in them, a Tomb Prince and a Necrotect. They have a dirty magic banner that enables them to do reforms at any point in their move. One of the characters also has the Amulet of the Serpent to give them poisoned attacks. The Tomb Prince also has a glitzy magic weapon. Given that the unit is as large as it is, given that Ian has 4 different resurrections in the army, and given that it's more or less smack behind that large piece of impassable terrain, I think it's highly unlikely I'm going to be getting through this unit, so my plan is to leave it well alone. Below it you can see the Boshabti, all 6 of them there. Each Boshabti always hits on a 4, and the Tomb Kings have got a spell that enables him to reroll his 1s. They have Strength 6, AP 1 and Armor Bane. They also have multi-wounds too, so are particularly good at shooting off monsters, of which I have many. Behind the Abshabti we have one of the Caskets of Souls. There's also another one which is hiding just on top of that rock formation at the bottom of the screen. There's then a single unit of skeletons to the top of that, which has also a Necrotect and a Mortuary Priest within its ranks. On one flank of those skeleton spearmen, you can just about see them there, are 2 level 3 wizards. One of these is the Hierophant, and this is principally where that spell threat is going to be coming from. And then finally there's also a Screaming Skull Catapult behind them. This is also obviously good at taking out monsters with its D3 plus 1 wounds. In addition, the Screaming Skull Catapult drops the leadership by 1 of things that are within 2d6 of the blast radius of wherever it hits. That means that Ian's going to be using Spiritual Vortex, the Screaming Skull Catapult, and potentially 2 Spirit Leeches to drop my leadership. That is of course critical when the Caskets come to fire. Caskets have a spell called the Light of Death, which makes you take a leadership test. If you pass it, you get bitten by a gnat and take a few Strength 3 hits. If you fail the leadership test, which is quite easy if you're taking it at a -4 or -5, you take D6 plus 3 Strength 6 hits with no regen and no armor save that do multi-wounds too. Apart from that, all Ian's got is that pile of skeleton archers that you can see there at the top of the battlefield. They're ambushers and so will be turning up later. Right, so moving on to my deployment. It's highly conditioned, as you can see, by the fact that there's that generous wood in my deployment zone, and I've stuck as many of my multiple wound monsters behind it as I can to try and shelter them from the casket. In places where I ran out of space, like for example there with Miss Mirror and Miss Dessard, I placed them sufficiently far back that the caskets were out of range. On the bottom of the battlefield, I've stuck another clump of my units, generally to see who goes first. Now I've got a champion in my Tribe Berserker Boys from Benidorm unit, who would normally, you would think, easily be able to clobber the Tomb Guard champion that Ian would have to accept with, because he's not got anything better. Unfortunately though, the nerf to Frenzy and the nerf to Flails means that my troop, who would normally have had 3 attacks at strength 5, has dropped to 2 attacks at strength 3, and thus has actually become distinctly awful at winning this special challenge which is engineered by the Chaos Gods, to such an extent that I can't even be confident of beating a crappy skeleton unit champion. Accordingly, Razormick cowers amongst the Marauder tribe berserkers to a sea of raucous bawdy cheers. Amidst this tumult, Ian rolls the dice and gets the first turn. Because his army doesn't move, and all of my high-value targets are either in cover or out of range, Ian directs his shooting at the southern side of my army. A combination of the Casket, Screaming Skull Catapult and Bow Shabti destroy 5 of the Marauder tribe berserkers and do a couple of wounds on the Shartak. In my turn 1, I push forwards, although not with heedless aggression. All my troops, including Fairfax the Chaos Dragon, barrel forwards to try to use that building as cover from the Caskets of Souls in the centre. My pink giant spawn Setsuna rolls like garbage for her random movement and is content to just stand there behind the wood. Meanwhile, there's no space for those 2 chariots, so they also decide to push sideways. When you're facing lots of shooting, it's always a good idea to give the enemy lots of targets or none, and I decide that it's probably better to stop my high-value targets getting near those Caskets of Souls, so I elect to keep my 2 chariots grounded. On my right-hand flank, however, I'm more aggressive, and I push up with all those remaining units. In particular, the Marauder Horsemen, with their 24-inch move-in marching column, are able to get to the southern side of that rock formation, out of sight of both of the Caskets. I'll be able to whip round that rock in a subsequent turn, and hopefully be able to threaten that Casket in turn 3. Speaking of turn 3, that's precisely where we're going to teleport to right now, because I neglected to take a photo of turn 2. Suffice to say though, I can easily summarise what happened. Ian's skirmishing archers, who I incorrectly said ambushed when they were actually scouts, fire at my Marauder tribe berserkers, as does the Screaming Skull Catapult, and flatten all of the boys from Benidorm to a pulp. Witnessing the demise of their masters, the dogs on the southern table edge whelp like the cowardly mutts that they are and fall back in good order off the board. However, Ian is not lucky with his Caskets, and one of them inflicts only a couple of wounds on the Marauder Horsemen before they and the Dragon Ogre Shartak manage to close behind that rock. My 2 chariots in the centre barrel up using their march move, and Setsuna gets a good roll on her random movement and follows closely behind. My dragon, other gigantic spawn and other Shartak all stand just outside of the Tomb Guard's march range to try and threaten the centre while also hiding from the Casket and the Bow Shabti. Moving on here to turn 3 of this game, Ian's Caskets once again can't do anything about the Shartak and the Marauder Horsemen on top of them. The latter close on the catapult and it explodes into a fragment of bone. Meanwhile, Trev the Dragon Ogre cracks the Casket in 2 with a mighty swing of his club. The Casket explodes in a serenade of heavenly music and both of the Tomb King wizards are hit. Unfortunately, neither of them are damaged, which is more than can be said for my own troops, as my Dragon Ogre Shartak and the Marauder Horseman's eardrums explode in the brutality of Casket FM. Even though Ian was unlucky with this Casket, its explosion has actually netted him more points than the undercosted device was worth in the first place. We pan in this next shot to the centre of the battlefield, and as you can see, things have got spicy. In turn 3, I shoved my Marauders forwards, not realising I'd left Ian a charge. Very frequently in Warhammer the Old World, it's not obvious if a wide formation infantry can charge or not. You're not just measuring closest to closest like you did in 8th edition. You have to pay for lots of hypothetical wheeling and then see whether you can make contact and then close the door. Because quite frankly, life's too short, I didn't bother doing all this hypothetical measuring, and when we actually looked at it, it turned out that the skeletons could, with a maximum wheel, get there with a 6 on the dice, and that's exactly what Ian got. In the first round of this combat, the skeletons, abetted by their Necrotect's ability, are able to defeat my Marauders and make them fall back in good order. As is often the case in the perverse universe of Warhammer the Old World, a fallback in good order often advantages the person who gets it, and in this case I'm able to form my Marauders up into a much wider formation and thus swing with lots more attacks. This combat continues for several more rounds, with the Marauders destroying skeletons and the skeletons destroying Marauders. I am able to focus my attacks on some of the characters in this unit, and the Marauders are able to destroy the Mortuary Priest, The Necrotech drops down to 1 wound and has several lucky escapes by rolling 6s on his armor save. While we witness this pleasant spectacle of 2 infantry regiments grinding each other down in a classic-style combat, other important developments are occurring on this battlefield on the other side. As you can see, my troops that are in front of this Tombguard regiment are loitering outside of its maximum charge range. Meanwhile, I deliberately placed Fairfax the Dragon in such a way as he could charge the Casket of Souls, which you can't see in this shot because it's behind that building. The casket accepts its invitation and casts Light of Death on the Dragon Rider. Fairfax fails his leadership, but the casket doesn't roll well and only makes him drop 2 wounds. To the side of the Marauder versus the Skeleton fight, as you can see, I'm able to get both of my chariots into that Bo-Shabti unit. I would have been able to get Setsuna in there as well, but unfortunately she wasn't able to fit because she moves in the random movement phase. While the Bo-Shabti are able to damage Miss Mira's chariot to the tune of 2 wounds, 2 lots of Chaos Warrior chariots impact hits and various other attacks crush around half of the Ubshabti. Predictably, Fairfax gobbles up the Casket of Souls, which again explodes. Once again, both of the Tomb King wizards have a lucky escape from the clap of heavenly thunder, and neither of them are damaged. Ian's problem, however, is that his 2 wizards are somewhat trapped. Fairfax is standing there, right in front of them. The wizards themselves can't march. They've got the Marauder combat happening with the skeletons there behind them, and so they can't join that unit. And the Bo-Shabti are also locked with the chariots. Because they pushed themselves out wide to start resurrecting skeletons and Bo-Shabti, they're also not in a position to join that impregnable Tombguard regiment. The net is closed, and if we get to a turn 4, I'm going to kill those wizards. Here you can see the final situation of this game. In Tomb King turn 3, the Ushabti unit was reduced to just 2 models, and Miss Mira's chariot decides to restrain and reform. The reason is, of course, because she's right in front of one of those Lich Priests. While she's too close to get her impact hits, herself and her Chaos Warrior crew impale the Tomb King's spellcaster. This leaves Fairfax free to barrel forward and crush the other Lich Priest into a paste. Andromeda Dessard, who is there on that base with those 2 pieces of blue tack, we had to make the model to fit, continues to grind out the Bo-Shabti. At the end of my turn 4, a single Bo-Shabti is left on just 1 wound. That then is the closing situation. The skeletons and my marauders continue to slug it out. The Bo-Shabti remain with just a single wound left, and the Tombguard block stand looking at some of my army, but completely unable to charge it. We count up the points, and the Wolves of the Sea end up about 450 points ahead. Ian's destroyed a unit of Marauder Horsemen, a Shartak, some dogs, and the Marauder Tribe Berserkers. Meanwhile, I've killed both his Lich Priests, both his Caskets, a Mortuary Priest, and am scoring 50% for that unit of Bo-Shabti that's just there left on 1 wound. Overall, I think this game was quite a close one. Ian wasn't particularly lucky with his shooting, although I do think I managed to conceal most of my high-value targets from any possibility that he could really take them down. In the final analysis, this ended up a 12-8 victory in my favour. I think had the game gone on for turns 5 or 6, it would have been a bigger win to the Wolves of the Sea, because I would have been able to destroy that final Bo-Shabti, and those skeleton spearmen surely wouldn't have been able to cope with the gigantic spawn and Fairfax in their back. Now, on retrospect, I played this game quite cautiously. While facing 2 Caskets and a bunch of Bo-Shabti is pretty frightening, it's actually pretty unlikely that they're going to be able to get through that many wounds of fast Toughness 5 and Toughness 6 Chaos Warrior real estate. The trick is, I think, when facing Caskets, to ensure that you're outside of 18 inches for that Spirit Leech Necromancy spell that those Lich Priests are invariably going to be equipped with. Remember that they can't move and then cast that. They're only going to be able to do it at the beginning of their turn. So if you can keep your stuff 18.1 inches away from it, then the worst he's going to be able to do to you is a Spiritual Vortex and maybe something from the Screaming Skull Catapult. That being said, the threat of D6 plus 3 Strength 6 hits, which go through armor and regen and do multi-wounds too, is enough to spoil the breakfast, lunch and dinner of any self-respecting Chaos monster. Right, on to my next round. I'm treated to a much nicer looking battlefield. I don't like the design on that previous one, it rather messes with my eyes and my camera. But this one here, this desert terrain, looks absolutely beautiful and everyone can see exactly where everything is. I'm also treated to a relatively unusual opposition, that being a Lizardman army, commanded by Pip. Now, Pip is one of very few players I've met on the competitive Old World circuit who remembers the Old World of competitive 8th edition very well. Now, when playing players who remember that game system, or of course who played the 9th Age or WAP, there is always, I find, when playing the Old World, something of a vague undercurrent of frustration at how clunky some of the rules are unnecessarily, whatever we may think about some of the stylistic changes to things like magic. Anyway, Pip is a very wise and reflective man, and has become, in the 2 games that I played him, one of my favourite opponents on the Old World scene. Now, these LIZARDMEN I'm facing are using the Renegade Square-based Legacy patch created by Val Heffelfinger and friends. As I'm sure all of you watching this video know, 7 legacy factions in Warhammer the Old World, those being the Demons, the Skaven, the Chaos Dwarves, the Vampire Counts, the Ogres, the Skaven and the Lizardmen, don't have proper army books, but instead have to use these PDF legacy lists, which, as I have said before, support these factions much as a rope supports a hanged man. They're bland, inadequate, and with the partial exception of the Chaos Dwarves and the complete exception of the Vampire Counts, are rubbish. They feature such ignominious anomalies as not allowing the Slann to go in the Temple Guard unit. Yes, you've got it, the iconic deployment of the Slann, which we saw in the very first Slann Mage Priest carried by Temple Guard model, isn't actually allowed to be effected in Warhammer the Old World, because that's an incompatible base size. Because some portions of the Old World community, taking a leaf out of 40k in Age of Sigmar, are in such thrall-like servitude to Games Workshop and have had their brains rerouted via some kind of broadband connection to a throne room in Nottingham, they won't even allow the Slann to go with his Temple Guard. Anyway, fortunately, those invertebrate protoplasmic jellies aren't in control of this tournament, and the legacy factions are in, so Pip can have the pleasure of putting his Slann in the Temple Guard. Anyway, now I've got that off my chest, let's have a talk about this game, because it proved to be a very good one. Now, first of all, as you can see, we've got some mission counters on these board. Those 3 circular LIZARDMEN Lustrian style items, which come out of Pip's toolbox. For every core unit with a unit strength at least 10 that's within 6 of one of those objectives at the end of either player's turn, that player scores 30 victory points, assuming there's not another eligible unit from the enemy that's closer to it than them. On its own, this secondary objective is important, but by no means dominant. If you're able to get the lion's share of control of the objectives, you might feasibly finish a couple of 100, maybe 300 points ahead of your opponent by the end of the game, which might, in a tournament where we're doing win-loss-draw, prove decisive. Anyway, so what's Pip got? He's got 2 blocks of skirmishing skinks with javelins. Now, when I played Pip before, I think he had about 4 times the number of these skinks, but that was of course before they nerfed the poison rules. Now, rather than simply automatically wounding on a roll of 6, which was the way poison used to work in all previous editions, now you just get +2 to wound. I don't like the poison change in 1.5. I understand they were trying to nerf those big poison blocks, and that's all very well. Unfortunately though, that across-the-board sweeping change has also had the unintended effect of hobbling both the javelins of the skinks and the hagbane tips of the wood elves. Now, these skinks can still vanguard and march and shoot, and so I'm still going to have to be a little bit careful with some of my big monsters. That being said, I expect Pip will try and use these skinks to score. However, because I've got random movement in my army from which the skinks won't be able to flee, and 4 magic missiles from Miss Mirror and Andromeda Desard, I'm not really too worried about these skinks, and very much doubt they're going to be unit strength 10 for very long. Aside from that, Pip's got some cool monsters, including 2 Bastillodons. I haven't got this on picture, but Pip's Bastillodons actually have a button on them that enables the rock to light up when they're about to do their solar beam attack, which may be one of the coolest single things I think I've ever seen in all of the years I've been hobbying. Anyway, the Bastillodons have got a magic missile, which does something to the effect, I believe, of D3 plus 3 strength 5 hits. It's not bad, and it's got a long range. However, the Bastillodon isn't very manoeuvrable, with only movement 4. Next, furthest to the right of Pip's army, we've got the old blood on the Carnosaur. Again, he's not bad. He's got toughness 6, something like 7 or 8 wounds, lots of high strength attacks, and a Carnosaur which does D3 wounds against large targets. To be honest, in the hero wing-wang match-off, if I get a couple of good prayer rewards on Fairfax and his rider, I'll probably be able to beat that Carnosaur. Still, it's a fight I'd prefer to avoid unless I have to go into it, and because I can fly and Pip's Carnosaur can't, that ought to be something I can manage. Behind the building on the north of the table, Pip also has a Saurus character who has a really cool tigery kind of cloak. He's either got the cloak of feathers or the Arabian carpet, I can't remember which, but this Lizardman character can fly and has got some high strength attacks. In previous editions, Lizardmen used to specialise in what we used to call cowboys, which were single characters that were very internally resilient. I'm not sure how viable they are in Warhammer the Old World, but perhaps this build represents the best that there is. And then finally, we've got Pip's main unit, the aforesaid Temple Guard, with Games Workshop fanboys look away now, the Slan standing inside of them. Oh, the heresy! Now, this Slan's got the wand of Jet, and can also, of course, re-roll one of his casting rolls, and so it's going to be very difficult for me to stop. He's running Elementalism, and he's got Travel, Mystical Pathway, and the Plague of Rust. Pip is rather unlucky though, because the only spell he doesn't get from that lore is Wind Blast, which I think would have been excellent in this game, because the Slan of course has a 360-degree vision arc from his floating board. One of the other spells he gets is Earthen Ramparts. The TO at this tournament is running a rather strange, in my view, interpretation of this spell, where not only do you not get impact hits or stomps if you go into a unit that's got Earthen Ramparts on it, by dint of it counting as having defending a low linear obstacle, it also means you can only get one attack because you're not considered to be in base-to-base contact. Therefore, all of my monsters will be relegated to just a single attack, no impact hits, no thunder stomps. So while that Temple Guard unit has the Earthen Ramparts on it, it's going to be invincible. That being said though, your opponent having an invincible unit isn't something to cry about. We saw that in Game 1 with Ian's unit of Tomb Guard. In Win-Loss Draw, it's possible to just avoid them. That being said, I think Pip is going to use these Temple Guards more aggressively than Ian used his Tomb Guard, and is going to advance into the middle of the table and score the central objective. In theory, that should also gum up my two spawns, my chariot and my dragon, and my Shartax from being able to have much impact on the centre of the table, or to get round to his Bastillodons. As far as my own deployment is concerned, I decide to keep both of my Marauder Horse units back there in reserve. These units are all about scoring, and so you have to try and preserve the unit's strength 10, but they can always run up with their marching column more or less all the way across the table, so there's not really a premium on pushing them forwards. I put all my mainline infantry, those being the Marauders and the Tribe Berserkers, up on the top of the board to try and go for the objective on the north. I also think they'll be able to chase off those skink skirmishers, and quite possibly also that flying character if they get involved. Apart from that, I think the game is really going to come down to avoiding the Temple Guard, trying to kill the Skinks and the Bastillodon, and trying to avoid the Carnosaur, while hopefully outscoring Pip on the objectives. I should say, though, that Renegade patch or not, these Lizardmen feel distinctly underpowered, and I feel as though Pip is fighting with at least half a hand tied behind his back. Right, we dice for turn 1, and this time the Wolves of the Sea win. On the bottom of the battlefield, you can see that Fairfax has pushed forwards and is threatening the Lizardman's centre. Because those skinks are in the way, that Carnosaur's not going to charge me. Also, I should say that while the Bastillodon's laser beams are fairly fearsome, they're nowhere near as fearsome as Caskets of Souls, so I'm not that bothered about them hitting Fairfax. If I recall correctly, Fairfax also got the temporary +1 toughness buff from the Chaos God's prayer table, which means he's up to toughness 7, so those Bastillodon's lasers will only wound him on 6s. Below the mighty dragon, Trev the Dragon Ogre pushes up. Setsuna careers forwards with her random movement and ends up putting herself on the side of that impassable terrain feature. This wasn't actually a great move. Later on, she gets rather bogged down and isn't really able to go round the terrain feature or manoeuvre properly, so she's able to get outside of it. However, the Marauder Horse in marching column are able to scoot forward, using the cover of the ruin, Setsuna and Fairfax to get within 6 of that objectives to start scoring me points. In the centre of the battlefield, I again push forwards, because this Lizardmen army is pretty slow, with the exception of that Carnosaur who's pushed far back. The Marauder Horse pushed to the centre to get their noses within 6 of that objective. I'm not confident I'm going to be able to hold on to this scoring unit for very long, but nonetheless it's still probably worth scoring 30 points while I can. Up the top of the battlefield, near that Colosseum-like ruin, you can see that the Marauder Tribe Berserkers have advanced into 6 inches of that other secondary objective. These Marauders are currently deployed in skirmish formation, and so if those skinks to the right of them get to them, they're going to probably have some kind of a charge. The magic phase, sorry, old habits die hard, sees Miss Mirror get off a ruby ring of ruin into those skinks that are advancing on the north. The streams of fire lance through the little lizards, scoring 10 hits and incinerating 7 of them, pushing them well below unit strength 10. I score 90 points from holding all 3 objectives before Pip even gets a turn. Mindful of the number of magic missiles in my army and the amount of speed that I have at my disposal, Pip decided to push forward with that southern unit of skinks to more or less go right in front of Fairfax. They are able to score the objective on the right-hand side of the battlefield by getting closer to it than my Marauder horsemen and are buying the lizardmen in the centre another turn free from Fairfax. As you can see though, they don't last long, and Fairfax and my Dragon Ogre Shartak smash into them. The Shartak takes the unit champion's challenge, and Fairfax stamps all over the remaining lizards. With a mighty 6 on his Thunderstomp, the Great Chaos Dragon obliterates every single one of them, not even leaving a single survivor. On the north, Pip's depleted unit of lizardmen skirmishers close on the Marauder tribe berserkers and throw javelins into them. This is enough to make the boys from Benidorm's already massive hangovers into terminal headaches, and 3 of them collapse. Pip is also able to have it that these skink skirmishers can't be charged by my tribe berserkers because I'm pretty much stuck on top of the building. In the centre of the battlefield, the shooting from the Howder of the Stegodon and those 2 Bastillodons laser off 2 wounds from Ashley the Gigantic Spawn, and also euthanize 2 of the dogs who were vegetating to the north of that structure in the middle of the battlefield by the park benches. The objectives are roughly tied as we head into turn 2 of this game. In the north of the battlefield, the Marauders, who had been performing some kind of unknown protest by gluing themselves to the Colosseum, unstick themselves to face those skink skirmishers. However, the Saurus hero, with his cloak of figures, flies in from the north and plants himself in front of them. The boys from Benidorm once again get their asses handed to them, and the Saurus hero chops 3 of them down. They break and run off the board with a massive roll. Fortunately, in my turn 2, I had anticipated that this would happen and turned my main unit of Marauders round to face whatever was still left of that combat. Against Dirty Dicks and Razor Mix football hooligans, the Saurus hero is already facing a combat resolution where he's down by 5. While he sticks once, in turn 4 he flees off the board. The football hooligans whoop and cheer in drunken vernacular and surge forward as they fail their overrun test. Park benches, municipal infrastructure and public conveniences are all sent flying in a sea of lawlessness. The hooligans are off the board. Perhaps not the worst place for them to be, given that Stegodon plodding in from the middle of the table. To the south, Miss Mirror waits for these boys with toys to get out of the way and aims a summoning and a fireball against the remaining skinks in the Colosseum. The little lizards are consumed by the corrupt chaos sorceries and are sent back to the spawning pool. In the centre of the battlefield, the Temple Guard have begun camping on the central objective, scoring pips and points. Urban Ramparts is more or less a continual feature in this battlefield, thus making this unit unchargeable. It would have been an option of Pip to use the Carnosaur to try and control the movement of Fairfax, but I don't think he fancies the match-up and is content to use his general to try and threaten the centre. Fairfax gets a quite fortunate long bomb charge on one of the Bastillodons and flattens the ancient beast. He would have had the other one too, but Pip pops his slan out of the back of the unit and casts a travel mystical pathway on it. This transports it to the safety of the other side of that building, where it's able to use its laser to knock 2 more wounds off Ashley the Gigantic Spawn. Fairfax is now facing nothing and is unable to have any further role in this game. On the south of the battlefield, Pip's Carnosaur rips into Trev the Dragon Ogre Shartak. Unfortunately for the Old Blood, he and his Carnosaur roll suboptimally, and the Shartak is left on a single wound. The blood of Dragon Ogre sloshing amidst its dentures excites the tender mercies of the Carnosaur, and it gains frenzy, thus careering forwards but failing to catch the Shartak. This is garbage luck for Pip. Had he been able to either kill the Shartak or chase it down, he would have been able to pass the leadership test and reform that Old Blood to threaten the centre of the board. As it is, much like Fairfax to his north, he's staring at nothing. In terms of the objectives, Pip is continuing to score with his Temple Guard unit, but I'm also continuing to score with my little unit of Marauder Horsemen in the south. Pip is there left rueing the fact that he doesn't have Wind Blast, which would have certainly been able to disable this little unit of Marauders from scoring. He has managed to take out the central unit of horsemen, however, but I've just run them behind that building to try and save their points. With the two generals staring at nothing to the north and south respectively, turns 5 and 6 of this game are a bit of a damp squib. The main action is actually the Spawn getting a large roll on his random movement and crashing into Pip's Stegodon. The titanic combat between these two great monsters continues for 3 turns, but in the final round of the game, both of them destroy each other with their thunderstomps, and the two great beasts fall on top of each other in a mute testimony to the carnage that has unfolded. Dramatic though it was, Pip is shaking his head. I had an 170-point Spawn of Nurgle that had already lost half his wounds, whereas he had a fresh Stegodon that was worth 80 points more. I think both of us rolled just about average, but the outcome of the combat was still the mutual destruction of both monsters. That's very satisfactory for me, not so satisfactory for him. This game has been a tight one, but we both feel as though I've just about got my nose in front. This is underscored in my turn 6, as Miss Mirror's chariot lumbers towards the Bastillodon that had been teleported out of the travel mystical pathway. With a mighty roll on her summoning, Miss Mirror banishes the Bastillodon in one shot to a side exhibit at the Natural History Museum. And that's the final situation after 6 turns. You might be wondering what that magnificent orange snake is in the middle of the battlefield. It's actually a summon elemental spirit, a spell created by rules designers who didn't know how to create spells and made some of them unbelievable and some of them absolutely pointless. Anyway, I'm not complaining, it looks awesome. Right, in the final analysis, the Wolves of the Sea finished about 400 points up on kills. I've also been able to outscore Pip by approximately 200 on the objectives. The result of this game overall is a just about scraped 13-7 to the Wolves of the Sea. This was a very good game. In the early stages, I think things looked quite close, but once my dragon got loose behind Pip's lines, there wasn't too much he could do. The Bastillodons weren't really powerful enough to be able to shoot off my monsters, and even though they were impregnable, there was only so much the Temple Guard could do. I think if that Slan had had Windblast, and if that Carnosaur hadn't been forced to overrun against my Dragon Ogre, things might have been a bit different. That being said, I don't think this was really a game that was that determined by dice. Most of the things that happened in it were more or less what you would have expected to happen, given average luck. I also don't think either of us made any particular mistakes. I also don't think either of us really out-deployed each other. I can only really explain the outcome of this game, therefore, by a discrepancy in the power level of our two armies. All of my stuff felt as though it was just a bit more powerful than Pip's. In particular, it felt as though my monsters were better than his monsters. Sure, he had an advantage in magic, but this ain't 8th edition, and magic in Warhammer the Old World, especially in version 1.5 when it's harder to get spells, is unlikely to win you the game on its own. So I go into round 3 feeling quite positive about my experience so far. I think both of the games I've played both felt like reasonable games of Warhammer, more or less compared to any other edition. Monsters, infantry, shooting and magic all felt relevant, but in not too dominant quantities. A little bland perhaps compared to some of the dramas of Warhammer past, but satisfying. Right, it's on to game 3, and now things are going to get dramatic. Here I am on table 1, facing an army that will shortly become, if it has not become already, the hegemonic rulers of tables bearing that number. Grand CATHAY. As you can see, my opponent has opened the fire escape, perhaps an invitation for me to run through it, out through the fields and away. However, I remember the old Chinese proverb that it is better to die in wisdom rather than live in ignorance, so I stay where I am. So Grand CATHAY have been part of the lore of the Warhammer world since the men of the East complemented the men of the West right back into 1st edition. They've set tongues wagging throughout the Warhammer world for many reasons. Some of these are good and healthy. Games Workshop have released a new Warhammer army for the first time in God knows how many years. They're represented by a new range of models which are being commended throughout the gaming sphere. They're not to my taste. After all, I think that model design has gone to hell in a handcart since about 1991, but many people think they're great. The rather less positive vibes to the release of Grand CATHAY have come out of those who have had the pleasure of facing them on the table, especially their hot air balloons. It would be fair to say that the CATHAY hot air balloon has developed the reputation in only a very short space of time for being amongst the most broken single thing to ever come out in Warhammer Fantasy, or perhaps indeed in any Games Workshop wargame since the dawn of time. While there are other rather ridiculously overpowered things in this army, which I'm going to moan about in a minute, it's principally the balloons that have got everyone in a tiz. Now, my opponent, Brian, a very interesting man, has been good enough to only bring 2 of them to this game, unlike certain other individuals who have ploughed their paychecks and indeed sold their kidneys so they can put 5 of the bastards on the table. Anyway, I'm not a man to make judgments by hearsay. Let's see if all this balloon talk's a lot of hot air or not. So these balloons have got about 1 million special rules, so for those who are still blissfully unaware, I will summarise. So the standard balloon can scout and fly and has 7 toughness 5 wounds with a 4-up armour save. The main problem though isn't those stats, which are good enough. It's simply that you can't engage the buggers properly. This is primarily because the balloon has a mechanic called disengage. Unless the combat is a draw, the balloon is able to fall back in good order. Assuming you win the combat, all you can do as the victor is follow it up 2 inches, so it's highly unlikely you're going to get to re-engage it. Note there are no break tests involved here. The balloon just gets to do this automatically because for some reason it's unbreakable. And then we come to its damage output. It has 5 gunners inside, one of them with ballistic skill 5 and another with BS4, who don't take any modifiers. If they hit you, they do D3 plus 1 hits with armor penetration 1 and armor bane 1. This means on average they're doing about 10 or 11 strength 4 hits every time they fire. In addition to this, if they go just within 6 inches of you, no, they don't have to pass over you, they just have to go within 6 inches of you, they get to put the large 5-inch blast template on your head and then scatter it. This is a firebomb, and if it hits you, you take a strength 5 hit with AP 2. With this combination of weapons against a ranked up infantry block, it's not uncommon for this to take out 20 or 25 models in a single round of shooting. In addition to the rules for disengagement, the balloon also has quick shot and fire and flee, and so charging it is usually not a great idea. So that's the problem with the balloons. They're really fast, they're really tough, you can't interact with them, and their damage output is insane. Yes, Punk, I do hear you there at the back. Of course it's not as bad as a dragon, but a dragon costs 500 points. These Sky Lanterns cost 135. Now, like some extremely powerful things in the game, they're not limited at 1 per 1,000 points, and as I say, some people have been turning up with 5, nay 7, if you include character mounts. Brian is, however, observing a comp. Namely, self-comp, because he realises that any more than 2 of these bastards is going to result in a pretty miserable game. Alright then, so if we discount those broken balloons, surely the rest of Grand Cathay can't be that bad, can it? Yes. Right, so what else have we got? Well, we've got the best cannons here in the game. These cannons have got strength 10, AP4, D3 plus 1 wounds, but what makes them really good is the Ogre Loader upgrade. This, once per game, enables them to either reroll a misfire like an engineer, or fire twice. Now that second mechanic in particular is fearsome. Very often in Warhammer, there's one critical turn where artillery have to take out a high-value target before it takes down them. When the going gets tough, the tough get going, and at that critical moment, these Grand Cathayan cannons can fire as though there were 4 of them. Right, next the Shengwen Generals and Shengwen Lords on their great spirit longbows, and we've got no less than 4 of these. So, the Shengwen Lord. For an almost identical price to a General of the Empire on an Imperial Griffin, you get something that is more or less equal to him in combat potential, is tankier, and, for free, is also a level 4 wizard. This Shengwen Lord is carrying the best magic weapon in the game, which is reserved for Grand Cathay only. It's called the Monkey King's Wisdom and is strength 10 AP4 and does multiple wounds D3. Because the mighty Shengwen Lord is also a level 4 wizard and can choose the Law of Illusion, this can also be combined with the Spectral Doppelganger. If you are unfortunate enough to have this cast on you in combat with this Shengwen Lord, you automatically take 2d6 strength 10 hits with AP4 and multiple wounds D3. Needless to say, this will of course destroy anything in the entire game. It's hardly as though the Shungwen Lord is a glass cannon either. Before you buy him anything, he's got toughness 5, 7 wounds, a 3-up armor save which isn't dependent on using a shield, and a 5-up ward save. Well, that's nice, isn't it? So let's introduce you to the Shungwen Generals, of which there are 3. So these are 6 wounds, toughness 5, 3-up armor, 5-up ward, 6 strength 5 attacks between monster and rider, and D3 plus 1 strength 5 impact hits. And they're also a level 1 wizard who can take the excellent Cathayan Fireball, or Hammerhand if they so wish. How many points is this, you might ask? 250? 275? No, punks. 145. Needless to say, all of our friends on their Great Spirit Longmas all fly. And speaking of flying, that's something that you won't be doing. Because Grand Cathay have a banner which stops you doing it. It does only work for 1 turn in every game, but you see, unlike the Bretonian Falconhorn of Fredemund, it can be carried by a core unit. Also, unlike the Falconhorn of Fredemund, you don't have to test to use it, because it works automatically. I didn't mention the Grand Cathayan core units. They don't do much fighting, but then it's hardly as though they need to. But here we are introduced to the Jade Warrior. The Jade Warrior has identical stats to a Bretonian Foot Knight. The only difference is that he's better because he can reroll 1s on his armor save and costs 3 points less. I am being facetious because anyone who knows anything about Warhammer, a community of persons who do not include those who wrote the Grand Cathayan Army book, knew very well from the moment they read the rules that this army was ridiculously overpowered. My opponent for this game is Brian. He's no internet-focused Xenical meta-chaser, but a grizzled old veteran who's played Warhammer competitively since 3rd edition. Now, for this battle, there are 2 special conditions at play. The first is the domination secondary objective from the matched play rulebook. This divides the table into quarters. At the end of the game, if you control one of these quarters uncontested, you get 200 victory points. If you have a higher unit strength than your opponent, you score 100, and if you have more than double what he has, you score 150. In addition, there was a colourful Saffron Slam themed objective as well. This came in the form of Geoffrey de Mandeville, the first Earl of Essex. So Geoffrey moves randomly around the table, and at the end of the game, if you have a core unit with unit strength of 10 within 6 of him, you control him and gain another 100 VPs. In this game, Geoffrey is represented by that black base to the north of that forest. However, both of us forgot about him, because this game became very intense very quickly. So, this shot here is from my turn 1. I should say that all of these games have featured this rather funky diagonal kind of deployment. You measure 30 inches along one table edge, 3 inches along another, and then push the tape measure to connect both of those points, and that's your deployment zone. Because these Saffron Slam battle mats are well short of the standard 6x4 foot, this resulted in battle lines that were very close together from the beginning of the game. Right, let me cut to the chase. I knew perfectly well, and Brian knew perfectly well, that my powerful, but still normal Warhammer the Old World army was going to be, and we shall be polite here, up against it. Now, because of this, I decide that my best hope in this game is balls-to-the-wall aggression. 2 other pre-battle events make me double down on this policy. The first is that Brian Shungwen Lord doesn't roll Spectral Doppelganger. There was only a 1 in 3 chance of this, but this now considerably changes the game because I can use Fairfax much more aggressively. The next is that I decide to enter Razor Mick into that warrior's duel that I can do by dint of being Wolves of the Sea. While, as I explained before, he's been completely nerfed by 1.5 by dint of not being able to use his flail and not being able to use his frenzy, I still think he's got more than a sporting chance against Brian's Jade Officer, who is the only unit champion in this Grand Cathayan army. Suffice to say, the Chaos Gods smile upon Razor Mick's flaccid efforts, and after 4 rounds of low-intensity combat, the Berserker unit champion eventually bores the Jade Officer to death. Right, so here's my turn 1. This battlefield, like all of those at Saffron Slam, is rich with large buildings and large woods, so there are plenty of places to hide my monsters. Because the Cathayan army has only got a handful of drops, I'm able to see where Brian puts his cannons before I place any of my monsters. As you can see, I place Fairfax and Setsuna there on the north of the table and barrel them forwards using that tower with the blue roof tiles as supportive cover. Behind them I also have my dogs and both units of Marauder horsemen in marching column. Their job is to run heedlessly and blindly at those grand Cathayan cannons to inconvenience them in the later game. On the south of the battlefield, Trev and Tone place themselves on top of each other and move into the forest. Meanwhile, Ashley the Spawn lumbers forwards on the table edge. I'm not quite sure what I was doing with my Marauder tribe berserkers, but they seem to just be loitering in the middle of the battlefield in front of those two balloons. Quite frankly, I'd have been better off pulling them backwards. The only part of my movement where I'm less aggressive are my two wizards on their chariots. I was contemplating barreling them forwards, but once again was reminded of that old adage that it's much better to give artillery no targets or lots. Given I've been able to hide all my remaining monsters with this generous terrain, I decide to opt for the former, and both chariot sorceresses stay put. We then move on to Grand Cathay turn 1. You can ill afford mistakes when you're facing an army like this, and I go and make one. Now I'd moved that dog dart in front of Ashley up towards those two Shengwen generals on their longmas. I'd done that in such a way that they wouldn't be able to place against Ashley and would have to charge the dogs and then overrun into him. I then had Trev and Tone sitting there waiting so they could charge the longmas in the flank. However, in a moment of scatterbrained stupidity, I forget to see out my own plan and I elect to flee with the dogs. The Pooches are fortunate to stay on the board, but then I realise the fatal mistake I've made. Both Shengwen generals successfully redirect and complete their charges into Ashley. If they beat him even by one, the gigantic spawn's going to be pushed off the board. On the north of the battlefield, though, I have got myself into a rather better situation against the third of those Shengwen generals. Brian continues his policy of aggression and charges one of the Marauder horse units with it. They flee, he redirects into the dogs, and they flee too. The Longma is obliged to move its full charge distance, of course, because this is Warhammer the Old World, and that places him within a few inches of Setsuna. Now that fight, especially with me charging him, is surely one that's got to be good for the Wolves of the Sea. Because all the Longmas declared failed charges, there are no Cathayan fireballs for me to deal with this turn. In the shooting phase, Brian takes the unusual option to not fire with his cannons, because he reasons that there aren't sufficient high-value targets for him to shoot to risk a misfire. As you can see though, the balloons surge forwards. The one closest to it chucks its incendiary bomb at that big block of marauders, but fortunately for me it misses, although roasts two dogs. Brian is conscious to the danger of my two Dragon Ogre Shartaks if Ashley unexpectedly manages to hold and turns his balloon's crane guns on the hulking beasts. Despite being in cover, Tone is mown down by the aerial machine guns. The combat phase arrives and I silently pray to the Chaos Gods that Ashley will be granted a reprieve. My prayers seem to be answered as both Lonma's attacks and their impact hits inflict only a single wound on the gigantic spawn. If Ashley can do just a single wound in reply with his multiple random attacks and his thunderstomps, I'm going to pin those Longmas in place and be able to charge them with my remaining Shartak. However, it's not to be, and despite Ashley rolling a 6 on his thunderstomp, the elite Cathayan riders shrug off all of the damage and win combat by 1 and push Ashley off the board. One of the Longmas overruns off the table, but the other restrains and reforms to face Trev, who is still in the wood. My turn 2 sees a couple of what I hope will be quite promising charges. Setsuna rolls the 7 she requires on her random movement to crash into the Shengwen general on the north table edge. To attempt to seal the deal against this flying character, I advance my Marauder horseman to his right. The reason I've done this is because if I can get the Cathayan hero to fall back in good order, I'll bounce him off the board. At the bottom of the battlefield, Trev also gets into that other Shengwen general. I'm not that confident, I must admit, but I do have 4 Strength 7 attacks. In the middle of the battlefield, I decide that my Marauder tribe berserkers, cornered as they are by these balloons with their 360-degree arc of vision, have no choice to charge. Not that they really had any choice about that. They are frenzied. Despite being right on top of the tribe berserkers, the balloon of course has quick to fire and rattles through its shots with no modifiers. 5 of the berserkers are shot to pieces. On the rest of the battlefield, both of my fleeing dog units fail to rally and both run off the board. In the centre of the table, my chariots push forward, hoping to use their magic missiles against these threats from the air. I expose these two chariots partly because I've decided to go for it with Fairfax. I considered cowering him behind the buildings some more, or indeed charging the Shengwen general in the middle of the table. While the latter was a tempting charge, I thought it was likely that Brian would just flee and leave the dragon looking at nothing and facing both the cannons. Realistically, those guns have got to go, and so I decide to plonk Fairfax more or less smack on top of both of them. I try and fiddle around and angle Fairfax to give the cannons a slightly worse chance of being able to connect with him at such short range, because of course in Warhammer of all editions, cannons can only overshoot. Nevertheless though, Fairfax is going to be taking 4 cannon shots in the face come the next Cathayan turn. There are of course 2 units of Jade Warriors standing by these cannon. But of course there are now no longer any champions in this Grand Cathayan army, so I'm not worried about them challenging out my dragon and forcing a win on combat resolution. Realistically, I think that if Fairfax can survive those cannon shots, he'll be able to destroy both war machines and there won't be anything else that can realistically threaten him, even if he is badly damaged. In the magic missile phase, Miss Mirror and Mr. Sard's magic missiles are largely stopped by the nearby Shengwen Lord. However, one of the sorceresses does manage to rattle one through, and the nearest balloon takes 2 wounds. In the combat phase, the Marauder Tribe Berserkers ready their flails. They've still got 11 attacks that are hitting on 3s with strength 5. Unfortunately, they roll like absolute horse shit and only damage the balloon to the tune of 2 wounds. In reply, the balloon retaliates with sandbags, maps and compasses and manages to destroy 4 of the Berserkers with its hand-to-hand attacks. You know it's not your day when crazy barbarians with flails are being outfought even in hand-to-hand combat by a bunch of bureaucrats standing in a hot air balloon. The balloon wins combat by miles, but Razor Mick himself, who is all that's left of this unit, unexpectedly passes his brake test and the balloon disengages. Immediately behind this, Trev readies his great weapon to try and behead the Shengwen general, but connects only with thin air. The Shengwen general is unimpressed and merely fiddles with his moustache and repeats some Confucian proverbs about the value of patience. The pen is genuinely mightier than the sword, and the Dragon Ogre Shartak takes 2 wounds and is pushed back into the wood. This is a pretty rubbish turn so far, but I've left the best combat till last, and Setsuna thunders into the Shengwen general. Unfortunately though, despite this combat being in my favour, herself and her heavenly opponent tie at a single wound each, and the combat is locked. Cathayan turn 2 arrives, and Brian has some moderately challenging dilemmas. The first is what to do about Fairfax. He does consider holding his Shengwen general back and casting Column of Crystal to try and block the dragon's charge. In the end though, he decides to take what's coming to him and rams the Shengwen Lord forwards into the middle of the battlefield to threaten my chariots. Of course, had Brian had the spectral doppelganger here, he would have been using that Shengwen Lord very differently. The 2 Shengwen generals on the southern table edge also behave aggressively. The one who defeated Trev in the last combat phase jumps forwards into Razor Mick. The other, that of course overran off the board after defeating Ashley the Spawn, re-enters the battlefield and plonks itself in front of the Dragon Ogre. In the Cathayan shooting phase, once again the incendiary firebomb misses its target. However, their combined shooting rends apart 10 of that Marauder unit that's just sitting there in front of it like turkeys. Then the Grand Cannons open up against Fairfax. The first shot hits him and wounds him, but I pass my ward save. The second is a misfire. The third hits him in the head and does 4 wounds. The fourth hits him, but rolls a 1 on its roll to wound. Fairfax has got away with it, and I've given myself a chance of getting back in this game. To underscore that point, Setsuna fights well in the combat phase and smashes 3 wounds off the Shengwen general, who does none in reply. The rider tests on a 6 with no reroll, but unfortunately sticks. On my turn 3, Fairfax bellows in rage and surges into the cannon. Despite the extra wound cachet afforded by its ogre loader, the Chaos Dragon easily tears it apart. Fairfax, being a somewhat intellectual and chauvinistic Chaos Dragon, is also partial to Chinese proverbs. To shoot the eagle, one must draw one's bow fully back, which amounts to much the same as in for a penny, in for a pound. All this is a very long-winded way of saying that Fairfax takes the obvious option available to him and overruns into the second cannon. Down in the south of the battlefield, Trev tries again and charges the Longma rider on top of him. He has better luck in the combat phase and damages the beast to the tune of 2 wounds and suffers none in reply. Once again though, much like his brother fighting Setsuna to the north, the Shengwen general passes a crucial break test. One of these impertinent balloons is standing right on top of my infantry block, and so the marauders can hardly resist the invitation to charge. You would think with 15 of them on top of it, I'd have a decent chance of winning combat. Unfortunately though, the balloon's machine guns open up once again, and 5 of the marauders are cut down before they even make it in. Depressingly, in the combat phase, we do no damage whatsoever on the Sky Lantern, which wins combat substantially by dint of that stand and shoot, and the marauders fall back in good order off the board. Pity the poor infantry punk. I might be biased in this instance, but it doesn't seem quite right to me that 15 of them can be on top of something so highly maneuverable, charge it, and then still get smashed. The other balloon is of course loitering in front of both my chariots. Such hubris! Now, much as I want to let rip into it with both of them, I realise that I can only charge with one. The reason for that is of course because these lanterns have got fire and flee. If I charged both chariots, it would be able to choose which one it fled from, because that's the way fleeing works in Warhammer the Old World, an often underestimated change from 8th edition when you had to declare your reactions when the charge went in. It could have simply chosen to flee from Mr. Sard, and then it would have bounced through various parts of the army and would have ended up on the side of the board behind that Shengwen general locked with Trev. That would have suited the balloon fine. It would have got a free pot at one of my chariots and escaped to safety, all with no downside. However, by putting Miss Mirror into it alone, I ensure that its flight path away from her would take it off the board, so it has no choice but to hold. In the combat phase, the chariot's impact hits the sorceress and her Chaos Warrior assistant smash the balloon down by 3 wounds. Unfortunately though, much like a bar of soap in the bathroom, the balloon uses its disengage mechanic and floats harmlessly away. At this point, as astute viewers will notice is often the case when I'm up against it, I forgot to take too many photographs. Anyway, suffice to say, Fairfax demolishes the second Cathayan cannon to leave Bran with no artillery. The Great Chaos Dragon reforms, and in a subsequent turn launches a long-bomb charge on one of the smaller units of Jade Warriors. Despite the perfect harmony in which they live their lives, and if we take the lore in the Grand Cathayan Army book literally, having their minds unclouded by any form of vice or corruption, for some strange reason the warriors fail their terror test and leg it off the board. Fairfax is doing well here and is keeping me in this game. At this point in proceedings, I sense a familiar presence beside me. It's Matt Pass, a veteran of the 8th Ed crowd, who had his Tomb Kings eviscerated by this Cathayan army in the first game. Both of us are of course remnants of that old and rather misremembered world. He's curious, no doubt, to see how his old compatriot is holding up against Games Workshop's latest Cool Kid army. He gives me that curt nod that Englishmen often give each other when they meet in foreign lands and disapprove of certain things that they find there. However, despite the steam rising from my ears, this game ain't over, and it's going to be decided here in the middle of the board by these Longmas, these hot air balloons, my chariots, and my gigantic spawn. The conclusion of what has been, despite my caterwaulings, a thrilling game of Warhammer is nothing if not dramatic. Things get off to a bad start from the Wolves of the Sea as Trev is unable to complete his earlier heroics and is skewered by the Longma and its rider. In my turn 4 on the north of the battlefield, Setsuna suffers a humiliating defeat to this other Longma and its master and is pushed backwards. Unfortunately for me, this enables the elite rider to jump on one of my units of Marauder horsemen who had been placed there to escort him off the board. He slaughters 3 of them, pursues the remaining 2 and careers off the table, which has the added benefit of being able to hide him from Setsuna. The annihilation of the first horse unit unfortunately panics the second and they also flee the board. This is of course what can happen in Warhammer if you lose something on your turn. The enemy gets to reform and then gangbang something else where you don't want him. The pudding is beginning to sour for the Wolves of the Sea, and unfortunately things continue to head south. The other hot air balloon is able to absorb a second chariot charge, and once again slide away. The Shengwen Lord and the Shengwen General both engage my chariots. I neglected to say that both of these sorceresses had been vigorously praying in the earlier stages of the game, and both of them had received the best Chaos mutation and a couple of supporting ones too, and so are actually not in too bad a shape to take on these Longmas. Andromeda Dussard fights well against the Shangwen Lord, but loses combat by 1. She tests on a 9 and breaks, fleeing through my other chariot, but still remaining on the board. Unfortunately, Miss Mirror, facing a much easier combat against the Shangwen General, also manages to lose by 1, and also fails a test on a 9. The floodgates open as Miss Mirror bounces through Miss Dussard and off the board. The Shangwen General overruns and fortunately finds the fleeing Miss Dussard on his flight path. That was an unforeseen and horrible series of dice there, punks. I failed 2 Leadership 9 tests. Had even one of those been passed, I wouldn't have lost either wizard, and instead I lost both. The tragic misfortune of the end of this battle is completed by Setsuna. She arranged herself in such a way that ensured that she would be able to fight the Shangwen General one last time. He's on the edge of the board, and so I need to win combat only by 1 to push him off it. Despite this combat being completely skewed in my favour, Setsuna once again flails with all her attacks and does no damage. In response, the Longma and its rider bring the gigantic Chaos Spawn down. She collapses on top of him by dint of the Timber Rule, but the effect of yet another clutch of Strength 6 hits does no more than extinguish the Cathayan's pipe. And that, as they say, is that. After 6 turns, my whole army is destroyed. The fact that I lost all of those pieces right at the end of the game, of course, has a double whammy effect because we are playing domination. The convenient last-minute vacation of my troops from the table enables Brian to claim 3 of the 4 quarters uncontested. He also is able to outscore Fairfax on the other. This nets him a further 700 victory points. In the final analysis then, despite this battle being very close right up until the end, I also suffered the same fate at the hands of the Cathayan Juggernaut and was smashed by 18 points to 2. So the dust settled on my first game versus Grand Cathay. It resulted in nothing less than my largest single defeat in any game of competitive Warhammer this side of the pandemic. Dr. Blaxill's Waterloo. And perhaps the beginning of his demise. Now we must be calm and reflective about this red letter day, an occasion which will no doubt be marked by the wearing of black armbands on its subsequent anniversaries. While it is my opinion that Grand Cathay are overpowered, and in some cases oppressively so, the main reason I lost this game of Warhammer was because I rolled badly. That being said, if I had rolled better, I still think I would have lost this game, albeit by a slim margin rather than a crushing one. I should also say something else about my opponent Brian. My sense is that he's regarded using Grand Cathay as something of a test run. While he's obviously an excellent player, I don't think he really tried that hard to use all of his Warhammer skills when playing this army. I think he allowed himself to perform experimental and highly aggressive maneuvers, which perhaps he wouldn't have done if he was playing something else. I should also note that of the many small ambiguities that go into games of Warhammer, on each and every occasion he gave me not just the benefit of the doubt, but possibly something a bit better than the benefit of the doubt. While I can only doff my hat to him, it does make me worried. Worried about what this army would be like when there are 5 hot air balloons on the table, and what this army would be like in the hands of a determined gamist who didn't give his opponent those benefits of the doubt. All I can say is that while I very much enjoyed this game, I'm not sure I'm going to enjoy those if and probably when they come. So that was the end of day 1. Unfortunately, I had business of a distinctly commercial nature which consumed my evening. Accordingly, I was unable to attend the traditional Saturday night dinner, which is often a fixture of these Warhammer tournaments. Indeed, I heartily recommend going to these if you are at a tournament that organises them, because they really help you get to meet the other players. Despite my enforced anti-socialism, I did enjoy a second excellent gastronomic experience in the local area in the shape of a visit to the local fish and chip shop. As I was consuming them, I turned on the television in my hotel room and flicked over to the Discovery Channel. On it was a documentary about the history of hot air balloons. Right, so I check out of my hotel and arrive back at the venue for day 2. My 4th game here is against Bretonians, something of a reversal from the usual matchup where I've been enjoying destroying Warriors of Chaos armies with my own Bretonians. So my opponent here is Ed, who got 3 wins yesterday and is, so he says, only on his 20th game of Warhammer the Old World competitively. He hasn't played older editions, or indeed Age of Sigmar or 40k. Most gamers, even if they are primarily committed to Warhammer the Old World, have several mistresses on the side, so to speak. But Ed is as close to as could be as somebody who is in an entirely monogamous relationship with Warhammer the Old World and Warhammer the Old World alone. Only later do I find out why he's such a good player, despite having such little actual battlefield experience. And that is that he is the recipient of something very modern and hitherto unencountered by me, namely professional coaching, in this case by the YouTuber Close Order. Now, I'm forever fascinated by all aspects of the hobby's anthropology, sociology and economy. Many intriguing questions are posed. Can you coach Warhammer? And if so, how good can someone get and how quickly if they're in the hands of the right kind of master? When I stop to think about it for a few moments, though, the answers are quite obvious. Of course you can coach Warhammer. I can think of several players from my more distant past who taught me a great deal and knew they were teaching me as well. That was, of course, in the more distant past, in editions of Warhammer Fantasy which I think were significantly better from a technical perspective than Warhammer the Old World in terms of the clarity of the rules, the precision, and the degree to which you could play the game competitively rather than by gentlemen's agreements. I do, however, think it's an innovation, and if the students enjoy it, and the coaches enjoy it, and both benefit from it, then as far as I'm concerned, it's all to the good. Anyway, let's get into the game. The first notable point about Ed's Bretonians is the absence of something that there are usually rather a lot of in competitive Bretonian lists, something my army at last count had no less than 11 of. I speak, of course, of Pegasi, and Ed only has 2 of those. The first, who is sitting proudly beneath his owner's chair, is the Duke. He's got the Ogre Blade, the Virtue of Knightly Temper, and Syrian's Locket. In popular parlance in the UK circuit, this is what is known as the Lambo Duke, after the player who conceived of him. Essentially, he smashes people to bits with a truckload of attacks, because the Knightly Temper gives him an extra D3 in hatred. While I think that's probably a better match-up for my Chaos than the Duke with the Virtue of Heroism, I still don't want to get charged by him, even Fairfax. Ed's second character, who was almost completely obscured behind those Colosseum-like pillars, is the BSB, also riding a Royal Pegasus. This BSB has the Grummel Great Helm, a War Banner, and the Virtue of Duty to add +3 combat resolution into any fight he enters. I must admit this somewhat warms my cockles. This Paladin BSB, with an almost identical loadout of magic items, has been part of Bretonian armies since the golden age of 5th edition. Even though Warhammer the Old World has evolved from its high and mighty past, there are all sorts of Easter eggs that call back to previous editions for those who can remember them. We then have a couple of wizards on the right-hand side. The first we have the lady in the green dress, who is Ed's level 1 wizard on the Law of Illusion with the glittering robe. And then immediately in front of her we have Ed's prophetess. She has elementalism and a law familiar. Her spells include Travel, Mystical Pathway and Windblast. Then on to the rest of the army. And here we see, in the words of Blackadder I, peasants. A lot of peasants. We've got 3 units of between 10 and 12 bowmen, and then a slab of 40 men-at-arms. Men-at-arms are as cheap as chips, and the buffs to infantry have helped them considerably. The final spell that Ed's prophetess possesses I neglected to mention, which is of course Earthen Ramparts. In this tournament, as I said before, they're playing this rather peculiar interpretation of the spell, where all multi-attack targets against a unit with Earthen Ramparts up only get a single attack. While the men-at-arms have got that, they're going to be like Pip's Temple Guard, invincible. As for the knights, we've got a single unit of Knights of the Realm that are also behind that ruin, and then on the right-hand side of the table, a big unit of Grail Knights. Now, I never believed in these Grail Knights the moment I saw their rules. I thought that they were massively overcosted, and the meta game agrees with me. Hats off to Ed, though, for trying to breathe some new life into an iconic but sadly underused Bretonian unit. In this game, there are 2 secondary objectives at play. The first are those strategic locations. Just 2 of them, we've got 1 of each in each deployment zone that is symbolized by that Pokemon ball coloured circle. The other is the flanking force scenario. We have to secretly select approximately a third of our army to go on one flank of the table. There's also a bonus available if units from that flanking force destroy some of the enemy. With it being a 9 AM start, I was unfortunately a little sleepy and so neglected to take a photograph of my deployment. Therefore, let's beam into my turn 1. Now, this flanking force mission is, in my opinion, not particularly meaningful in this game, partly because these saffron slam tables are smaller than the conventional 6x4, and so the fact units are on one flank doesn't really make that much difference. That being said though, I think the scenario does rather gum up Ed's deployment, and he ends up placing both of his knight units in positions where they're not immediately able to affect proceedings. He does of course have travel mystical pathway, and so we can't be sure they're going to be blocked by their own peasants or buildings for very long, but this does enable me to push forward somewhat more aggressively, although the Duke still keeps me back. I suspect the centre of this battle is going to come down to a bit of a Mexican standoff. However, on the flanks I think I can be a bit more threatening. Ed's turn 1 arrives, and it's a very quiet one. His prophetess carts earthen ramparts on the men-at-arms, and then scoots forwards with her mounted squires to aim a wind blast at the marauder horsemen, but unfortunately can't get the spell off. He elects to reform with his Grail Knights to face my marauder horse and tone the Shartak who are coming round that building. To be honest, I'm completely fine with that. If the Grail Knights want to go and dick around with those low-value units, then they're unlikely to be a factor in the main line of the battle. That being said though, they're probably going to ensure that I don't kill them, and I'm going to have to get some points from somewhere. As far as his characters are concerned, Ed is content to leave the Duke more or less where he was, threatening the middle of the battlefield. His BSB though scoots round to the left. Perhaps the plan is to combine with that Knight of the Realm unit and get some kind of charge on one of my monsters and beat it on combat resolution. Ed's shooting phase is an absolute rinse. As well as failing to get Windblast, all 30 of his peasant bowmen either miss their targets or fail to wound. In Chaos turn 2, I'm once again aggressive on the flanks. I leave the centre vacant because I don't want to be dicking with that Duke. Both Trev and Fairfax advance. I've plonked Trev pretty much in front of that Knight of the Realm unit, ensuring that they're chaffed. If they charge him, no doubt they'll beat him in combat and probably get him to flee, but I doubt with 8 attacks they're going to kill him. Fairfax follows closely behind. I'm absolutely fine for Ed's BSB to charge the Chaos General on his own. What I can't afford though is a combi charge, and that's why Trev's there to stop it. If the Knights of the Realm do go in there and rinse Trev, I've got Ashley the Gigantic Spawn and Mr. Sard's chariot lumbering up behind. I'm quite satisfied with this side of the board. I don't think Ed has got any attractive charges. I also don't think he's going to be able to get out of the way either. My dragon, my spawn, and my Shartak, or any combination of all 3 of them, is going to have a good charge next turn. In my centre, I hang back out of the Duke's charge range, and on the right-hand side, I decide not to push forwards given that huge Grail Knight unit that's staring at me. I do, however, decide to push the dogs up towards the peasant bowmen, hoping that perhaps Ed might be tempted into a charge, whereupon I can connect with Setsuna and Miss Mirror. To be honest though, I'm absolutely fine with it being quiet in the centre and quiet on the right-hand side, because I think I'm going to score some points on the left. There's not really a great deal that's to be said about Ed's next turn, because he doesn't really push forwards. He doesn't take the charge that I've left him with his Knights of the Realm, but instead decides to scoot his BSB back into the centre. His prophetess does enjoy some magical success, getting earthen ramparts on the men-at-arms, travel mystical pathway to reform the Grail Knight unit, and also a wind blast which knocks out 2 of the marauder horsemen. The Duke meanwhile decides to fly out to the right-hand flank and also threatens my Dragon Ogre's Shartak. Ed's archers in the centre open fire upon the dogs and slay 3 of them, but the remaining pair pass their panic test. Coming into my turn 3, I feel very much in control of this game, but I still haven't scored any points. As predicted, that changes on the right-hand flank. The archers flee off the board, and Trev and Fairfax charge the Knights of the Realm. I'm initially surprised by Ed's decision to flee off the board with this unit. However, the more I think about it, the more I think it's actually a rather good piece of play. The Knights were almost certainly toast, and by fleeing off the board they preserve the 50 points I would have got for capturing their banner, and they also pull Trev and more importantly Fairfax out of position. Of course, you're not able to reform after a failed charge, and so both Chaos units are sat there looking at nothing. With the Duke now out on the right-hand side, the centre of the battlefield is freed up for me to push forwards. I do so as far as I can with both my gigantic Chaos Spawn, and also my Marauders leave the deployment zone, leaving the horse unit behind them to score. I also reroute Mr. Sard's chariot towards the centre. If that BSB charges me, fine, I'll just flee. My sorceresses also enjoy a very successful turn of magic missiles, and Miss Dessard eliminates 5 peasant bowmen from the unit behind the BSB, but they pass their panic test. For her part, Miss Mirror fries 4 of the peasant bowmen from the unit in front of her, although uncharacteristically these peasants also pass their panic test. In Bretonian turn 3, Ed decides to start getting more aggressive to try and recoup some points. Things get off to a reasonable start as the Grail Knights spur their mounts into tone and destroy him. On the north of the battlefield, the Prophetess's Windblast and the remaining peasant bowmen's arrows also destroy what is left of that Marauder horse unit. It is easy for me to summarise the remainder of the battle from here. Ed's Duke jumps into the centre of the board, and so do his Grail Knights, who are in the process of being moved in this shot. His BSB also launches himself into the Marauder tribe Berserkers and is challenged out by Razor Mick. However, the Pegasus riding hero fights badly and the combat ends in an unlikely draw. A problem that Ed has is that his Prophetess has pushed too far out to the right to be able to continue to cast earthen ramparts on the men-at-arms. As you can see, literally my whole army is on top of this peasant foot unit. I do have to be a little bit careful in my turn 4 though when contemplating my charge. While it's easy to get in for all my monsters, the Marauder football hooligans are going to need a 6 to be able to make it. If they don't get in and Fairfax gets in from the side, the men-at-arms are of course going to flee away from him because he's the largest unit, and then there's no guarantee I'm actually going to be able to catch them. What I want them to do, of course, is flee or fall back in good order off the board, and to do that I'm going to have to pile up unit strength from their front. This charge phase sees 2 decisive pieces of good fortune fall on my side. The first is that the Marauders, albeit with Warband, get the 6 that they need to storm into the men-at-arms. The unlikely draw achieved by my Marauder tribe Berserkers last turn has given Fairfax a 19-inch charge, the maximum he can declare. He goes for it and gets it, just being able to place corner to corner with those dogs standing behind him. In the combat phase, the men-at-arms are doomed. They've got Ashley, Setsuna and Treb stamping them to pieces with no earthen ramparts to come to their rescue. The press of Marauder football hooligans from the front leaves no ambiguity about which way they should run to escape this carnage. This combat is so obviously one-sided that Ed just skips to rolling for his break test. He fails it, and the men-at-arms flee off the board. This now means I control both strategic locations. Because Ed's next turn is obviously going to be the last of this game, some of my pieces career off the board. The combat involving Fairfax also falls in my favour. While the Chaos Dragon's attacks are all bounced by a lucky roll from Ed on the Blessing of the Lady, Chairman Eddie and Fairfax's Thunderstomps obliterates the Bretonian Paladin. Fairfax fortunately passes his restraint test, or he would have been surging into the Grail Knights, a combat he'd likely have lost. The Chaos General's intervention has of course saved the Marauder tribe Berserkers, who reform into a screen in front of the Grail Knights to chaff them up. Ed is obviously going to destroy those in a mighty last charge. The question is whether his Duke's going to be able to do enough damage on his own to get him back in this game. In Ed's final turn, his Duke has really got 3 viable targets. The Marauders, which would be absolutely suicidal given they've got a unit champion, Miss Mirror, whose chariot is lumbering away to the side of the board, or Fairfax himself. After some thinking, he elects to charge Miss Mirror. My initial reaction here is that this is a mistake. Not a mistake in absolute terms, but a mistake in the context of a win-loss-draw game. There's no point minimising your margin of defeat when you're playing win-loss-draw. Given that he's already quite far behind in the game, I think the only way Ed's going to come back into this is by rolling the dice against Fairfax, and to hell if the Duke fails. Given a bad decision here could cost me the game, I decide to do something I don't often do in competitive Warhammer, which is take a running points tally. As it is, I'm about 500 victory points up. Therefore, there's really no point fleeing with Miss Mirror and giving Ed's Duke a chance to redirect into Fairfax. I'm better off just holding with her. I've got sufficient cushion to allow him to kill her. I'll still end up about 250 points up even if he does. As it transpires, Ed picks up the dice and fails a 14-inch charge into Miss Mirror. Well, that was unexpected. Perhaps the Chaos Gods are subtly tipping their hat to me in the heavens in approval of my strategy. Or at least, I like to think so. Right then, Game 4 was at an end, and it finished a 12-8 victory for the Wolves of the Sea. Had Ed's Duke slain Miss Mirror, as by all rights he should have done, it would have only been an 11-9. This was an enjoyable game of Warhammer. Both of us played quite conservatively and didn't take too many risks. I think the crucial moments were me muscling off those Knights of the Realm on the left-hand flank, Fairfax getting that 19-inch charge into the BSB, and then the Duke failing to kill Miss Mirror. The fact that all 3 of those fell in my favour meant I was able to claim a skinny victory. That being said though, this game was by no means a topsy-turvy one, and I felt fairly in control of the battle throughout it. That being said though, if you are going to try and play this kind of skinny win Warhammer, you have to be careful. One bad move, or one bad piece of rolling right at the end of the game might turn the skinny win that you've been carefully curating into a draw or even a skinny loss. That didn't happen here, but well, on another day, perhaps it might have done. During the closing stages of my game with Ed, I couldn't help noticing some whoops, cheers and howls from the table next to me. Brian's CATHAY army is on it, and it looks, on first impressions, as though it might have been defeated by these orcs and goblins. Once they've calmed down after what was obviously a momentous and memorable game, the players tell me what happened. Apparently John, a very experienced Orcs and Goblins player, like me, tried to go absolutely balls to the wall with this CATHAY army. He deployed his Doom Divers behind some of the impassable terrain and found that the large bases of the balloons enabled him to hit them indirectly. He's put his army back on their trays here, but apparently he deployed his Goblin regiments in long lines over the table to stop them being hit by the balloon firebombs. This in turn gave him enormous flexibility over where he could release his numerous fanatics, and apparently they did enormous work in bringing down both the balloons and the Longmas. Despite all this game was still incredibly close, and the howl I heard was literally from the last turn. 3 of the Longmas, including the Shangwen Lord, were in combat with the Borbor unit, which passed a break test on 3 with no reroll. This dramatic piece of good fortune, when the Orcs were backed onto the table edge and looked for all money as though they'd lost, enabled them to hang on to the skinniest of wins. Well, I guess that proves that CATHAY are beatable, but boy, it sounds like it took something exceptional to do it. Right, so on to my game 5. I've got 3 wins and 1 loss so far, and remember that this tournament is playing win-loss-draw. Therefore, if I win this one, I think I've got a good chance of a podium finish. So my opponent here is Michael, who I last played with my Bretonians at the London Grand Tournament in my 3rd game. You can see that battle report, along with the others in that campaign, on a separate video. Anyway, this time he's using his Tomb Kings rather than his Orcs. It's a slightly different list to the one that I faced against Ian in the first round. Sure, it's got 2 caskets. Sure, it's got a bunch of necromancy spells to drop my leadership. But there are no Beau Shabti here. Instead, there are absolutely zillions of small arms skeleton archer fire and skeleton horse fire. I think he's probably got around 60 shots. Now, while strength 3 arrows fired by ballistic skill 2 skeletons hardly seem very threatening, remember that these are arrows of the Asaph, which means they always hit you on a 5. Michael's also got an elementalist in his army who gets Plague of Rust, and so those 2 factors added together can be at least some danger, even though it's nothing like as dangerous as these would have been in the days where the Amulet of the Serpent still wounded things automatically on 6s due to poison. All of these numerous horse archer and skeleton archer units are of course all skirmishers. Michael's literally moving around every single model individually. I must admit, part of me does sigh when I see this. While I don't blame players who are playing competitively for using them, I really think that the makers of Warhammer the Old World have blundered by allowing so many things to be skirmish. Anyway, look, it's hardly as though I've practiced what I've preached. I'm the one who's been scorching the earth with Pegageddon Bretonians for the last year. Anyway, look, punks, what else has Michael got? He's got about 3 or 4 wizards. Most of them don't leave that clump of archers next to the casket in the Necrosphinx, so I'm unable to locate any specific models. Speaking of that Necrosphinx, this fast-range dangerous threat is joined by a prince on a bone dragon. This cheerful chappie has got the armour of never dying ever. It's actually called Armour of the Ages, in the sense of dynastic ages, and I suppose that's appropriate, because it would literally take you the age of an entire dynasty to bring a model wearing it down. Whenever I face this guy, who is a popular build amongst Tomb King players, I treat him in much the same way as I treat all unkillable units, and just try and avoid him. Anyway, much of the same challenges apply as were the case in my game against Ian. I don't think I was quite aggressive enough in that, and so I'm going to be more so in this one. This battlefield features no less than 4 strategic locations, which you can see represented by those green discs. Now, traditionally, Undead are extremely good at playing these strategic location missions because they can sit on them and resurrect models. However, in this case, I don't think that Michael's quite got the right army for this. Sure, his stuff can waddle forwards and score, but it's also kind of inherently vulnerable to being smashed off because these skirmishing archer units, even though they can be resurrected, could be flattened in a single turn. Now, the deployment in this game is quite involved, and it's one of several games where I think I managed to get a slight advantage over my opponent. We're not actually allowed to deploy in a small square on each other's respective sides, and you can see that one represented in my deployment zone by those lines of purple dice. I begin my drops by ganging up my own units behind that forest, deploying them in columns so I can shelter as many of them as I can from the caskets of souls and the archers. I deploy some of my other high-value units on the other side of the table, away from both of Michael's caskets of souls. He actually drops one of the caskets on the left-hand flank, which means that I might be able to outrange it. It also means I might be in a good position to cover its line of sight. One other advantage I get is actually in the selection of one of my demonology spells. While I've tended to swap them for the summoning, Mr. Sard has the fortune to roll Steed of Shadows. Now this is a very powerful movement spell, giving one of the infantry regiments Fly 12. I really like the idea of this. I think there's a good chance that I can simply throw those marauders in the middle up the table in front of one of the skeleton archer blocks and really put the pressure on Michael in ways that he's not expecting. I once again contemplate sending Razor Mick into that Wolves of the Sea challenge, given that he's only going to be facing a crappy skeleton horse archer. In the end though, I don't like the idea of doing this, because if he's taken casualty it means my Marauder Tribe Berserkers won't be able to score, and I think I'm going to be wanting to do that because of the number of strategic locations there are on the table. As it happens though, the Chaos Gods smile on me and I win the roll for first turn anyway. My turn 1 begins with Andromeda Desard reaching up to the heavens and urging the Chaos Gods to grant her the Steed of Shadows to propel the Marauder football hooligans across the board. I contemplated not doing this and simply hanging back and trying to score with the strategic objectives, but in the end it was too much for me to resist. The main combat threats to the hooligans are of course the Bone Dragon, who is on the other side of the board and behind that ruin, and the Necrosphinx. I'm able to guard against the latter simply because the football hooligans have been pushed up so far there's nowhere for the Necrosphinx to place if it did want to charge. As Michael points out, it would be technically possible for the Necrosphinx and the skirmishing skeleton archers to both charge the marauders, and God knows how we'd resolve that given the skirmish rules. Suffice to say though, we agree that a combined charge isn't possible. Now obviously Michael isn't going to be able to afford to allow those Marauder football hooligans to charge the skeletons in front of him, and so he's going to have to dedicate most of his shooting to getting rid of them. Therefore I rush forwards with the rest of my army. Fairfax, my 2 chariots and Setsuna all rush up the right hand side of the board, including one of my skirmishing units of horse to score on the objective on the right. Trev and Tone, my Dragon Ogre Shartax, go as fast as they can through the difficult terrain. The only check to my advance is a rom roll from Ashley the Gigantic Spawn's random movement. In the end I decide to not move him anywhere, because that Casket of Souls on the left hand side of the board probably won't have any targets if I keep him where he is. My turn ends with me scoring 90 points to Michael's 0 by dint of controlling 2 of the objectives with Marauder horse units and the 3rd with my Marauder block that's been transported forwards by Mr. Sard's Steed of Shadows. Tomb King turn 1 begins and Michael rearranges all of his numerous skirmishers to optimise his position relative to my troops. This requires quite a lot of careful play and careful placement, and of course takes a very long time because he's got to move each model individually. You can see that his skeleton horse archers are shielding the skeleton archers. That's because Michael's quite happy for Fairfax to charge them, because he's got a unit champion in there that he knows he can keep resurrecting and fight an eternal challenge with the Chaos Dragon Rider. Meanwhile, he brings his Bone Dragon up to the side to threaten the Marauders and the 2 Shartax that are rampaging through the woodland. As you can see, the Tomb King magical exertions are highly successful and they get off Plague of Rust, Spirit Leech and the Curse of Years on the Marauders. Michael fires all of his arrows of the Asaph, his magic missiles and the single casket that can see the Marauders into the unit of barbarians and destroys no less than 14 of them. The barrage of Tomb King ranged firepower also eliminates 4 of the dogs that were running up alongside them. Unfortunately for me, despite the nearby presence of Fairfax, both units fail their panic tests and run towards the table centre. In my turn too, I continue my policy of aggression. Fairfax is able to trace a line into those skeleton archers on the back of the board. Note this wasn't a gotcha from me. Michael moved his skeletons back as far as they possibly could do, and Fairfax was still able to draw a line from the corner of his base. I'm fortunate enough to rally my 11 fleeing marauders and decide to use them to support Fairfax's aggression in the middle of the board. Because there are still 11 of them left, they're still able to score that strategic location. To be honest, I don't give them a very high life expectancy, but once again I'm hoping they're going to consume all of Michael's shooting resources and give me the ability to press forwards. This shot here is from after the combat phase, and it won't be a surprise to know that Fairfax obliterated the skeleton archer unit. However, I show this to reveal something which was out of my previous shot, which are the 2 units of 5 skeleton horse archers cowering behind the building behind Fairfax. Because these bony riders have got the reserve move, they're very difficult to actually get hold of in hand-to-hand combat. I take advantage of the fact that Fairfax's presence is damming them up and move Setsuna and Miss Mirror round the other side of the building to try to hunt them down. On the left-hand side of the board, I advance aggressively. This is greatly facilitated by another successful incantation from Miss Dessard, who uses the Steed of Shadows this time on the Marauder tribe Berserkers. Given these nutters are already in marching column, this spell enables them to fly 36 inches across the battlefield. That's easily enough to slap themselves on the left-hand side of that building, where they can potentially threaten the Casket of Souls, which has gone for a little walk round the back with its reserve move. I also leave the back of their base within 6 inches of the strategic location on the left, meaning I'm scoring all 4 this turn and netting 120 VPs. For his part, Trev is able to wheel round out of the arc of that bone dragon. The same's not true for Tone, and there's no way he's going to hide, so he just lumbers forward and accepts that if the Bone Dragon wants to charge him, he's going to. The one mistake I make with my placement is that of Miss Dessard. After she's sent the Tribe Berserkers up the field, she pushes forwards a bit too much. That brings her into potential charge range of both the Necrosphinx and the Bone Dragon. If the former wants to have it at her, I'm fine with that. She is of course riding a chariot, and so the Necrosphinx's Killing Blow and Monster Slayer won't work against her. The Prince though, that's a bit of a different kettle of fish. In Michael's turn too, he takes both of the charges I've offered him. The Prince successfully evokes his My Will Be Done ability and gives himself another inch of charge range. Quite frankly, I don't fancy it with Miss Dessard, and she elects to leg it. However, she doesn't roll very far with her flee distance, and instead of redirecting into Tone the Shartak, Michael decides to barrel forwards. His own roll's a bit rubbish, however, and he stops short of Miss Dessard by about 5 inches. The Necrosphinx, however, enjoys rather more success. The Marauders also elect to flee and connect with that building. Here we see an example of why playing multiple editions of fantasy sometimes can mess with your tactics. In 8th edition, they would have just bounced through this impassable terrain and ended up on the other side. Old World, though, compels them to, and I quote, run round the building. If you will pardon my French, whatever the fuck that means. It's a moot point anyway, because their roll is low, and the great golden winged beast surges forward and slaughters every single one of Razormix's men. It also passes its reform test and turns round to look at Fairfax. The Tomb King shooting phase is not a great one for Michael. Most of his resources are expended trying to bring down Fairfax, and even though the Great Dragon fails one of his leadership tests, he only drops 3 wounds. Michael does do some chip damage elsewhere on Trev the Shartak and Ashley the Gigantic Chaos Spawn. Useful though this is though, I don't think this is going to be enough to stall the Chaos advance, and soon we're going to be on top of the Tomb King HQ. Particularly notable is the failure of the archers on the left-hand side to do any damage to the Marauder tribe Berserkers. That means that unit continues to score, and I'm still holding 3 of the 4 objective points. He's already about 400 points behind on mission points alone. This does demonstrate with these strategic locations how quickly the water can start rising over your head if you're being significantly outscored by your opponent. In the next shot here, we pan to Tomb King's turn 3. In my turn, Setsuna and Miss Mirror both got charges off on those 2 skeleton horse units which were behind that building. Setsuna in particular gets a monstrous roll for her random movement and is able to push the skeleton horse archers off the board. Fairfax meanwhile had no other viable targets other than the skeleton horse unit in front of him. Michael was very careful in the position of all of his skirmishers and arranged things in such a way that the skeleton horse archers screened all of the HQ behind it. Now, of course, Michael wants me to do this charge because he knows that that unit's got a champion that he can keep resurrecting ad infinitum and challenge Fairfax out. Good play though this is, it does make me rather roll my eyes at how ugly this looks. Look at it, an enormous blob of skirmishing models from about 3 or 4 different units, I'm not sure which. If you're watching this game's designers, and I know you are, Linehammer, fix this. There are far too many skirmishes in Warhammer the Old World. This sort of thing's better left to Age of Sigmar and Warhammer 40,000. But in fantasy, we're on square bases for a reason, punks. Anyway, look, it was a good move by Michael. I've got no real choice but to accept the charge he's given me, and Fairfax gets locked in a long-running combat where the Skeleton Horse Archer champion keeps coming back to life. One word of warning, though, to undead players who like doing this. While it is good play to tie up a powerful character with a Horse Archer champion or a Skeleton Unit champion who keeps coming back to life, do remember that you can only do the resurrecting in your turn. That means that in his turn, he's going to get to swing at your unit, and there's a good chance they'll all die. And yes, I know that means you're going to get your turn next, but be careful of the overrun move in Warhammer the Old World. You don't just overrun when you charge and wipe something out like you used to in previous editions. In Warhammer the Old World, you overrun all the time, and straight forwards, regardless of where the enemy was eliminated from, so you can get trapped. In Michael's turn 3, he aims a Spiritual Vortex and a Spirit Leech at Ashley. He also curses the Lumber and Chaos monstrosity with the Curse of Years. Ashley's reduced leadership of 7, though, is still enough to resist the casket, although he does take several wounds from the skeleton archers. In the magic missile phase, Michael's Lich Priest, who had been hiding behind that building, aims a wind blast at Trev and pushes him off the board. This also panics the dogs behind who flee the field. That's a mistake from me there. When facing adversaries with wind blast, you should never place your units within 2 inches of the edge of the board. Fortunately, I've only cocked up with a low-value unit. As you can see in Michael's turn 3, he also charges the Necrosphinx into the side of Fairfax. I'm not too bothered about this. I neglected to say that in my last turn, Fairfax smashed to pieces the Skeleton Horse Archer unit champion, who is now being resurrected by the numerous invocations. I think Michael is hoping that he can get Fairfax to fall back in good order off the board by ganging up on him. However, Fairfax's close order bonus and the fact that he overkills the Skeleton Horse Archer champion means he still wins combat and so goes nowhere. Meanwhile, I should have mentioned that in my turn 3, Mr. Sard doesn't rally and continues running towards the table edge. Michael's Bone Dragon attempts a long bomb charge, but Mr. Sard's Chariot rolls a 7, which is more or less the perfect number that she needs to just about stay on the board but also be out of the Tomb King's charge. For the first time in the game, Michael is able to outscore me on the objectives by riding those Skeleton Horse Archers closer to that objective counter than are my Marauders, scoring with those core archers who are near the back of the Necrosphinx, and also managing to damage the Marauder Tribe Berserkers to the tune of 1 wound and thus dropping them down to less than 10. My turn 4 sees some more decisive charges. The Marauder Tribe Berserkers had spent the turn rearranging themselves from marching column to skirmish and crash into the Skeleton Archers on the left-hand side of the board. This should be a good combat for me here. I've got Frenzy and I've got Flails, and I'm going to be getting an absolute boatload of attacks. Because Fairfax won combat in the last phase, both the Necrosphinx and the Archers were forced to give ground. Fairfax was then able to reform himself and launches himself over the Skeleton Archers and into the Casket of Souls. As he's done before in this tournament, once he's crushed the first war engine, he's going to overrun into the second. On the right-hand side, my Marauder Horsemen fancy their chances against those Skeleton Horse Archers and spur their mounts into a gallop. I forget, as I usually do, that in Warhammer the Old World, skeletons can stand and shoot, and they lose one of their number going in. In the centre of the battlefield, despite having lost 3 wounds, Ashley easily rolls high enough to surge into the Skeleton Archer blob in the centre. Tone doesn't quite have the gas to get in, however, and his own charge falls short, but it'll be in next turn. Meanwhile, Miss Mirror and Setsuna the Gigantic Spawn both run round the edge of that building, but stay outside of the arc of that Necrosphinx. If we get to a turn 5, they're going to be surging into the Tomb King HQ, whom we're going to have cornered on all sides. The combat phase largely falls in my favour. The Marauder Horse unit, whirling their flails, smash apart the Skeleton Horse Archers. On the north of the field, Fairfax lashes out and crushes his 3rd Casket of Souls in the tournament and overruns into the 4th. The other 2 combats also fall in my favour, although not decisively so. Ashley, who has been very quiet in this tournament so far, rends apart 5 of the Skeleton Archers and also gobbles one of them up to restore one of his wounds. On the left of the table, I must admit I had high hopes for the Marauder Tribe Berserkers slashing away with their zillions of Strength 5 attacks, but once again they roll badly and don't do anywhere near enough damage to collapse the skeletons. Michael's turn 4 begins and it's obvious that we're running out of time. He doesn't really have any good shooting. Fairfax is in combat, Ashley's in combat, Tone isn't worth many points, and Miss Mirror and Setsuna on the other side are undamaged. He is, however, able to resurrect all of the skeletons who died in the last combat phase. Michael's only real scalp is the destruction of Trev, who he turns all his arrows on and his wizard spells. The Shartak is brought to the floor by this hailstorm, but his sacrifice means that we're not taking damage elsewhere. The final combat phase of this game sees Fairfax stamp all over the Casket of Souls. It, like the one in the last turn, explodes, but only destroys a few skeletons. I think Michael saw this coming a turn ago and had the foresight to attach his Lich Priests to some of the units to spare them the damage. In my turn 4, I neglected to say that Mr. Sard rallied on the edge of the board and is able to march her chariot up behind that rock out of the Tomb Prince on his Bone Dragon's Vision Arc. In 8th edition, of course, she'd have been toast because she wouldn't have been able to move, let alone march, after she's rallied. But in Old World, of course, she can. I'm not sure I agree with that stylistic rules choice, but never mind, it's helping me on this occasion. The remaining combats with the Tribe Berserkers and the Skeleton Archers in the middle of the board are also largely a wash. I had been hoping that Michael would resurrect sufficient models to grow the back of the Skeleton Archers on the left closer to the board edge, ready for the Tribe Berserkers to push them off. Unfortunately though, the Marauders fight a bit too well this time, and some of the skeletons are peeled off the back rank. This gives them enough space to get pushed back and not hit the edge. And that then was the closing situation. I'm only scoring one of these objective points with my Marauders in the south, but when we count them up, I have a lead of about 350 points on objectives. Because I'm also up in kill points by about 200, this ends as a 12-8 victory to the Wolves of the Sea. Of course, we only got 4 turns in here, and I do think that if we'd got a turn 5 and a turn 6, I probably would have won this game by more. While it's no certainty, because the Tomb Kings still had the Bone Dragon and the Necrosphinx left still standing, as well as all their wizards, I think I had considerably more stuff bringing up the centre than Michael did, and so probably would have been in more of a position to profit. Anyway, that's all hypothetical. I must admit that one thing I've noticed with Tomb Kings is that they're obviously a slow army to play. There's a lot of admin at the beginning of the turn and a lot of fiddling around. The skirmishers with their reserve move also take ages. I don't think Michael was playing slowly, I just think he had a huge number of things to move and a huge number of things to remember to do. I do think this is a systemic problem with Warhammer the Old World, especially now we've got missions. Unless you play with one of the more powerful armies with loads of 360 in it, or play with double dragons, some of the more fiddly or more marginal kinds of lists, especially with multiple smaller units, do take longer to play. That's why I think there should be a premium on streamlining some of the core rules. Rules like having to measure arcs of sight from every single skirmishing model. Rules like the reserve move. Rules like having to pay for your wheel out of charging. And rules like having pursuit based on physical contact rather than comparing who rolls the higher dice roll. While I get that the makers of the game were trying to forget that 8th edition ever existed, it wasn't necessary to re-inject all of this clunk. Anyway, punks, whether you enjoy my content despite my occasional whinges about how much things were better in the age of 8th edition, or because of them is beside the point. You're still here. Looking around at some of the live tables around me, I can see the results of some of the other games. Behind me, poor old Pip's Lizardmen have been tabled in 90 minutes by Brian's CATHAY juggernaut. Elsewhere, the only player who had 4 wins going into the 5th round, John with his Orcs and Goblins, seems to have got into a mess against Ed's Bretonians. Apparently he tried to pay for a draw and mucked up the points calculations, and that's actually led him to a skinny loss. Therefore, it looks as though there are going to be several players that are on 4 wins. Anyway, we gather round and the TO makes the final announcements. The first is the result of a lucky dip for players who entered their army lists through some software called Second in Command. The lucky winner is Brian, who has scored 83 points with his Grand Cathay, including 4 crushing victories, including against me. And what more fitting prize could there be than another box of Grand Cathay? And then comes the unexpected announcement that despite winning a lousy 51 out of 100 points, that the champion of the Saffron Slam is Dr. Blaxill. Well, that was unexpected and does raise some questions. I had no less than 32 points less than Brian, who had 83 points from his 5 games. However, in this tournament, the tiebreaker after win-loss draw is actually the algorithm's strength of schedule. Now this algorithm, which was the reason why I didn't win a tournament once upon a time in 8th edition, isn't one I fully understand, but it has something to do with the strength of the opponents that you played and how highly they finished in their games. Anyway, my 5 opponents finished with a slightly higher batting average than Brian's, so I am the one that walks away with the trophy. He has to just make do with another box of Grand CATHAY. Look, the argument for strength of schedule is that it's designed to reflect who had the harder path to victory, and so who had the harder games. It's not an argument I agree with. I think it's much more intuitive to use VPs as a tiebreaker if you're going to use win-loss-draw. That being said, I'm all for diversity and local variety, even if this particular system might have produced what looks on paper to be something of a perverse outcome. Right, so that was the end of the Saffron Slam. There's a lot to talk about with 1.5 of the Old World, which is why this tournament report has already crossed the 2-hour mark. However, I could hardly send you on your way without the traditional evaluative chit-chat and review of how this army performed. So go put the kettle on, but don't go away. So, what is there to say after my first 2-day tournament of 1.5? The first thing would be good. I think 1.5 is better than 1.0. It's better because there are proper infantry blocks on the table. The buffs they've got, and also those missions that have introduced by the match play guide, make them relevant. They also make dragons less all-conquering than they were before, although as you can see from my own battles, my own dragon did rather well in spite of that. All 5 of the battles I played were actually quite close. One of them was closer than it looked, the CATHAY game, and some of them were perhaps a bit less close than the scores on paper. However, none of these games were one-sided. If you watch my previous tournament battle report from the London GT from the end of last year, you'll find that all 5 of my games were extremely one-sided, and even though I won all of them and won the tournament, I thought this was boring. These games were much, much better. I would be lying through my back teeth if I tried to pretend that I thought that this game was anywhere near as good as 8th edition with comp and patching, but it is improving. Some of these improvements have been obtained at a price, and that price has been the increased complexity that 1.5 has brought. Some of the improvements, meanwhile, especially the introduction of the missions, have just been flat-out improvements with no downside. And certain things that I don't really think can be improved because the core rules weren't good enough. But better they patch them than refuse to change them. Overall though, look, while I'm being critical, and I think being critical is a much better thing to be about something you care about than a cheerleader, I am positive. Mainly because the game is alive. It's not just that Warhammer Fantasy has been brought back, it's that clearly the game has surpassed Games Workshop's expectations, which reinforces the interpretation that I hope will go down in all posterity that they were fools to blow up the old world and end Warhammer Fantasy in 2015. Anyway, look, there are still many challenges. 1.5 has created probably one problem for every 3 it's fixed. Also perversely, despite the improvements to the core rules, I have a suspicion that faction balance is going to get worse. In 1.0, many of the factions were quite competitive, even though the builds were rather repetitive. In 1.5 though, I'm not so sure. That one game against a rather dialed-down CATHAY list has made me suspicious that they're going to be very dominant on competitive tables, and I also think Tomb Kings and Vampire Counts will be too. I think it's going to be those 3 factions many miles ahead of the rest, and then a bunch of others in the middle jostling for next position. While I appreciate that I've gone and won a tournament myself with a faction outside of those, I don't think there are going to be too many examples of this in 2-day events with a reasonable number of players. Still, I suppose we'll see. There's plenty more to say about all of this, but perhaps that's for another day. As a matter of fact, there'll be a discussion session with me and my friend D6 Wounds, which I'll link to in the description, which will have been published by the time this battle report makes it onto my YouTube channel. So if you want more chat about the general state of things, punks, you know where to find it. Right, so the evaluation. So first of all, Fairfax, the ambassadorial dragon whose exquisite taste captivates his guests at the ambassador's reception. Anyway, I think he did rather well, don't you, punks? He didn't die in any of the games and scored colossal victories over all the opponents he fought. He wasn't remotely inconvenienced by the fact that his loadout was minimal. I think he could have taken on Ed's Duke, Pip's Carnosaur, or Michael's Bone Dragon, even though he decided not to. You see, a dragon in Old World is a bit like a nuclear weapon. It can force your opponents to behave differently, even if you don't actually use it in anger. You'll notice that I was a little bit careful with him throughout these battle reports. I made sure to send the Dragon Ogre Shartax in when I thought he might be challenged out. However, I also didn't hide him unduly. The fact that the dragon is so hard to kill means that if your enemy is going to invest in killing him and then doesn't, it's going to mean he'll have committed a large amount of his resources that could have been used on the rest of your army, killing squishier things. For my 500 points, I think I got a lot of board control out of Fairfax and was able to use my dragon to push round the enemy just like I would have been in version 1 of Warhammer the Old World. On another day, he could have chalked up some much more major scalps, but I didn't commit him to combats like that because I didn't think I needed to. Overall, for Chaos players watching, I think that these 5 battles rather vindicates the choice of a barebones Chaos Lord rather than an exalted champion. I like his toughness of 6 and I like his leadership of 9. Both these things make him much more resistant to Caskets of Souls. Right, on to my 2 sorceresses.
Miss Rentstrike occupied KFC Mirror.
And miss, I object to your patio extension on the grounds of reduced visual amenity, Dussard.
Well, I think they did alright. I think if you're going to take level 1 wizards and you're going to use magic missiles, then having 4 of them makes sense. They were able to contribute to the game with those spells and were also very useful in combat too. There were definitely points that I wished they'd had Hammer Hand rather than a second magic missile spell, but I think overall the choice of loading up more fireballs and threat at range was probably the right one. I'll definitely use them again, and I really like having 2 of them because I do think that they are well suited for mutually reinforcing each other. That's true of a lot of duplicate units in Warhammer, because they've got the same kind of movement and also have the same requirements as far as dependency or otherwise on your general and BSB are concerned. They can often mutually self-reinforce. Moving on then to my core units, and let's first talk about the football hooligans. I think the performance of these 25 Marauders should really warm the cockles of traditional Warhammer Fantasy players who are concerned about the role of infantry, as of course I was. They did a lot of scoring and also were able to outfight some other infantry, although admittedly they were fortunate to come up against men-at-arms and skeletons. They also enjoyed that victory against Pip's Saurus Hero. I also think their sheer body count was useful in the game against Michael when I threw them up the board with the Steed of Shadows. They weren't exactly too dynamic, they did really struggle with movement, but they felt relevant, they felt substantial, and they did enough things for me to feel as though they'd really earned their points. As for the 2 units of dogs, well, they were useful, but I think they could have been more useful against other opposition, because there weren't really too many things I came up against that I wanted to chaff, which is of course what these specialise in. As far as the Marauder Horse were concerned, I would say similar. In 2 of my games, especially the game against the Lizardman and my final game against Tomb Kings, they were also invaluable for scoring. Note that they were able to do this even when facing fairly shooting-heavy opposition. They were able to cower behind much of the rest of my stuff and keep themselves out of the theoretical threat ranges of magic missiles and also shooting. That meant that even though it was possible to knock them over literally with the squirt of a water pistol, that they were able to retain their unit strength and score me a lot of points on those strategic locations. My final core unit were of course the Tribe Berserkers, and I don't think they did well. As you'll see, I often ended up deploying them in marching column to disoblige me of the obligation to charge because of frenzy. If you're doing that, to be honest, I think you're probably better off not using the unit in the first place. Also, on the occasions where they did get the charge and were able to use their frenzy and their flails, they didn't really bring home the bacon. I can see a use for them as ambushers, but at the same time Wolves of the Sea can also allow standard Marauders, perhaps with the Mark of Slaanesh, to ambush as well. They'd be able to do it just as well, and quite frankly better, because they wouldn't have the obligation of frenzy to charge and it'd be less points. Accordingly, I'm sorry to say that 1.5 has made the Marauder Tribe Berserkers competitively redundant. On to rare, and we've got Trevantone, my Dragon Ogre Shartax. I think they were okay. They went around with Fairfax, took some challenges off him, and generally exerted some pressure. However, I'm not quite sure what it is about these Shartaks. They look really good on paper for their points, but somehow don't end up doing as much as you might think. That being said, I still think they're well worth their inclusion. And then finally, we've got Ashley, leave it out, Gov, and Setsuna,
Close the door!
the two gigantic spawns of chaos. I think they were really good and really resilient. I sometimes tended in some battles to split them up because I thought they were able to exert sufficient threat on their own. I love the fact that the enemy can't flee from them, and the fact that they're able sometimes to charge things outside of their vision arc. The fact that they're unbreakable and also so resilient also just means that opponents, I think, sometimes underestimate them. If you've got many other charge threats in your army, like a dragon and 2 chariots, then enemies are likely to get bogged down on these gigantic spawns. Overall, these 5 battles and many a test game have confirmed my belief that these are amongst the best troops in the game for their points. Right, thus concludes this rather long tournament report with all of its scenic detours. There's much to discuss and much to contemplate. But now, of course, dear viewers, we're reading a newspaper rather than a mere history book. Such is the privilege of being a man of now rather than a man of yesterday. While it's true that such stories may be tomorrow's chip wrapping, they also can be today's gossip at the bus stop. Isn't that exciting?